Chapter 6 Wild Animal Sovereignty. In the previous two chapters, we have focused on domesticated animals. Now we turn our attention to non-domesticated animals, those living relatively free of direct human management and meeting their own needs for food, shelter, and social structure. Within the broad category of non-domesticated animals, we find many different kinds of human-animal relations. In Chapter 7, we consider liminal animals, wild animals living in close association with humans. In this chapter, we consider the case of truly wild animals, that is, those animals who avoid humans and human settlement, maintaining a separate and independent existence, insofar as they are able to, in their own shrinking habits or territories. For wild animals, the model of dependent agency and co-citizenship in a mixed human-animal community, which we have just outlined for domesticated animals, is neither feasible nor desirable. Although wild animals avoid humans and are not dependent on us for their daily needs, they are nonetheless vulnerable to human activity. This vulnerability varies according to geographical proximity to human activity, adaptability of a particular species to ecosystem changes, and the pace of those changes. We can think of these vulnerabilities as resulting from three broad categories of impact. 1. Direct intentional violence: hunting, fishing, trapping, the kidnapping of animals from the wild in order to stock zoos and circuses, or to meet demand for exotic pet keeping and trophy collecting, or other wild animal body or body part uses, the killing of animals as part of wildlife management programs, and the harmful experimentation on wild animals in the name of scientific research. 2. Habitat loss: the continuous encroachment of humans, whether for habitation, resource extraction, or leisure and other pursuits, into animal-inhabited territory in ways that destroy habitat and deny animals the space, resources, and ecosystem viability that they need for survival. And 3. Spillover harms: the countless ways in which human infrastructure and activity impose risks on animals, from shipping lanes, skyscrapers, and roadways to spillover effects like pollution and climate change. While the vast bulk of human impacts on wild animals are negative in one of these three ways, we can also imagine a fourth category of potentially positive impacts. Number 4. Positive intervention: human efforts to assist wild animals, whether individual, for example, rescuing a deer who has fallen through the ice, or systemic, for example, vaccinating a wild population against disease. Whether in response to natural disasters and processes, such as volcanoes, food cycles, and predators, or in an effort to reverse or prevent human-induced harms, for example, rewilding and habitat restoration. Any adequate theory of animal rights must provide guidelines for thinking about all four types of impacts. In this chapter, we argue that traditional animal rights theory is inadequate in this regard, and suggest how it must be expanded and amended to meet the task. As we show, traditional animal rights theory has focused on the first category, the direct violation of basic rights, with much less attention to the other three issues. This is not just an accidental oversight, but rather reflects the limits of any theory that defines animals' rights solely on the basis of their intrinsic moral status. To address the other three issues adequately requires elaborating a more explicitly relational account of animal rights, one which articulates the sorts of relations between human communities and wild animal communities that are both feasible and morally defensible. As we will see, these are fundamentally political questions and can only be addressed by identifying an appropriate structure of political relationships between human societies and wild animal communities. We argue that one helpful way to identify these relations is to think of wild animals as forming sovereign communities, whose relations to sovereign human communities should be regulated by norms of international justice. Just as Chapter 5 argued that citizenship theory helps us to identify our obligations to domesticated animals, so here we argue that ideas of sovereignty and international justice help us to identify our obligations to wild animals. As will become clear, our aim is to expand animal rights theory, not to replace it. In this respect, our approach differs from much of the ecological literature, although we start from similar concerns. A number of ecological theorists have rightly criticized traditional animal rights theory for its inattention to issues of habitat destruction and other inadvertent harms, and for its inadequate understanding of the complex and devastating impact of human activity on wild animals and ecosystems. We draw extensively on these insights. However, as we argued in Chapter 2, the general tendency in environmental theory to subsume animals into the broader category of nature or ecosystem, thereby downplaying the distinctive moral significance of animal subjectivity and denying the inviolability of individual non-human beings. Indeed, many ecologists insist that a holistic concern with the health of ecosystems is incompatible with the idea of according rights to individual animals. Just as invasive plants may need to be removed to protect a vulnerable ecosystem, so too humans may need to engage in a so-called therapeutic culling of animal species that are damaging the ecosystem. From an animal rights theory perspective, however, it is essential to remember that amongst the many different types of entities within the ecosystem, some beings have a subjective existence that calls for distinctive moral responses, including respect for their inviolable rights. In fact, ecologists already accept this idea. After all, they would not recommend the therapeutic culling of human beings in order to protect a vulnerable ecosystem. Where humans are concerned, they accept that a commitment to protecting the ecosystem can and must operate within the constraints of the inviolable rights of individuals. We believe a similar principle can and should apply to animals. Our aim in this chapter, therefore, is to show how an expanded animal rights theory can address fundamental issues of habitat and ecosystem flourishing, while still maintaining animal rights theory's commitment to the inviolability of subjects. We begin by outlining the limits of the traditional animal rights theory approach to wild animals, and then develop our alternative sovereignty-based model, explaining what we mean by sovereignty, clarifying the sense in which it can be attributed to wild animal communities, and identifying the ways in which this model can help to articulate compelling principles for addressing the full range of human impacts on and interactions with wild animals. Section 1. Traditional animal rights theory approaches to wild animals. Of the 4 types of impacts that humans have on wild animals, animal rights theory has focused primarily on the first, the direct violation of rights to life and liberty. Enormous energy has been devoted to advocating for wild animals against the predations of hunters, trappers, exotic animal traders, zoos and circuses, and wildlife managers, and rightly so. The number of animals killed and harmed by these practices are horrendous. This focus flows naturally from animal rights theory's theoretical emphasis on basic negative rights for all animals, and provides an appropriate starting point for wild animal advocates. But for traditional animal rights theorists, this emphasis on the direct violation of basic rights is not just the starting point, but also the end point of animal advocacy. Their basic injunction is that humans should stop directly harming wild animals and then leave them alone, even if this means leaving them vulnerable to indirect harms from human activity or to being harmed by natural forces such as floods or diseases, or by other animals, predation. Thus, Tom Regan summed up our duty to wild animals in terms of, quote, letting animals be, end quote. Similarly, Peter Singer says that given the complexities of intervention in nature, we, quote, do enough if we eliminate our own unnecessary killing and cruelty towards other animals, end quote, and that we, quote, should leave them alone as much as we possibly can, end quote. And Gary Francione argues that our duty to wild animals, quote, does not necessarily mean that we have moral or legal obligations to render them aid or to intervene to prevent harm from coming to them, end quote. And he too suggests that we should simply leave them alone. In short, traditional animal rights theory has endorsed a hands-off approach to wild animals, strict prohibitions on direct harming, but no further positive obligations. Claire Palmer calls this the laissez-faire intuition, and notes that it runs very deep in the animal rights theory literature. However, this approach has been widely criticized as both too little and too much. It is too little because the injunction to let them be, at least as it has been traditionally understood within animal rights theory, does not address certain key ways that humans can harm wild animals, such as human expansion and habitat loss. As we have seen, the direct violation of basic rights is just one of 3 types of negative impacts humans have on wild animals, and even if we stopped hunting or capturing them, humans would still be imposing huge harms on wild animals by means of air and water pollution, transportation corridors, urban and industrial development, and agricultural processes. Of course, the idea of letting them be could be interpreted in an expansive way that covers those indirect harms, but to date at least, animal rights theory has had little to say about how to determine when these indirect risks and harms constitute injustices or how they should be remedied. It has also been seen as potentially too much, because if we say that wild animals have a right to life, it is not clear why this only generates negative duties of non-intervention and not positive duties as well. Animal rights theorists may describe their theories in terms of letting wild animals be, but critics have pointed out that according a right to life seems to require not only stopping humans from killing animals, but also intervening whenever the lives of animals are threatened, including systemic intervention to end predation and to protect animals from natural processes such as famine, floods, or exposure. If we should stop humans from hunting antelope in order to protect their inviolable rights to life and liberty, shouldn't we also try to stop lions from hunting antelope, perhaps by trying to fence all lions into their own separate space, or by putting them all into zoos? A reductio ad absurdum envisions the creation of soy protein worms for birds, or installation of central heating in wildlife dens in order to meet human duties of positive assistance to wild animals with a right to life. Invoking a right to life as grounds for prohibiting hunting of wild animals seems to open the floodgates to implausibly broad obligations to intervene in nature. Animal rights theorists have responded to these two criticisms, and in the process refined their views, but as we see, these modifications are both inadequate and ad hoc, although they do help point us towards a more adequate relational view. We will briefly review these refinements and then show how they naturally lead towards something like our sovereignty model. In response to the concern about loss of habitat, animal rights theorists have acknowledged that thriving ecosystems are a precondition for the thriving of individuals, and that animal rights theory must therefore find a way to accommodate these ecological concerns. Indeed, recent animal rights theorists have asserted that habitat protection is a key right for wild animals. Dunnayer, for example, states that with, quote, the possible exception of the right not to be murdered by humans, the most important right for free non-humans probably is the right to their habitats, end quote. John Hadley argues that this right to habitat can be formulated in terms of property rights for wild animals, which would protect them from forced relocation due to human expansion and ecological destruction. In general, however, these recent ideas within animal rights theory of a property right to habitat are underdeveloped and leave crucial questions unaddressed. It is one thing to say that a bird has a property right in its nest, or that a wolf has a property right in its den, specific bits of territory used exclusively by one animal family. But the habitat that animals need to survive extends far beyond such specific and exclusive bits of territory. Animals often need to fly or roam over vast territories shared by many other animals. Protecting a bird's nest is of little help if the nearby watering holes are polluted, or if tall buildings block its flight path. It's not clear how ideas of property rights can help here. Which parcels of land should be seen as the property of which wild animals? How and to what extent should human activity be limited in these territories? How do we monitor the boundaries and regulate mobility across these boundaries in either direction? What additional duties, if any, do we owe to animals in their own habitats? If property rights give animals the right not to be forcibly relocated due to human expansion, should we also protect animals from being forcibly dislocated due to the activities of other animals or due to changes in climate? In our view, animal rights theorists have left these questions largely unaddressed because they cannot be answered within a framework that focuses solely on the intrinsic moral standing of animals. As we have seen, that question underdetermines our moral obligations to particular animals or to particular humans, which vary with the nature of our relationship to them. Talk about a right to property or to habitat reflects an implicit recognition within animal rights theory that our relations with wild animals must be understood in more relational and political terms. However, as we will see, focusing exclusively on property rights is incomplete and indeed misleading as an account of these political relationships. We need first to ask what is the appropriate relationship between human and wild animal communities. a relationship which we think is best framed in terms of sovereignty, and then address the issues of habitat within that frame. We see a similar impasse in relation to the worry that recognizing a right to life would entail a duty to intervene in predation. Animal rights theorists typically endorse a laissez-faire intuition that we should not intervene in nature, even to protect wild animals from starvation or predation. Yet this intuition seems to conflict with the insistence that the lives of animals matter morally, and that they have basic rights to life and liberty. In response to this worry, animal rights theorists have responded with a series of arguments as to why they are not committed to wholesale interventions in nature. One set of arguments attempts to show why we have no obligation to interfere in cases of predation or starvation, even though giving aid to vulnerable animals might be laudable or praiseworthy. In the first edition of his classic book, The Case for Animal Rights, Regan noted that our obligation to prevent injustice, the wrongful violation of rights, is typically stronger than our obligation to prevent mere misfortune. So we have a duty to protect wild animals from human hunting, since this is an unjust action undertaken by a responsible moral agent, but no comparable obligation to protect wild animals from predation or suffering due to natural causes, since these are not the result of moral agency, and hence are unfortunate but not unjust. Similarly, Francione notes that American law limits our duty to aid even in the case of other humans. Quote, "If I am walking down the street and see a person lying passed out, face down in a small puddle of water and drowning, the law imposes no obligation on me to assist that person, even if all I need to do is roll her over, something I can do without risk or serious inconvenience to myself. The basic right of humans not to be treated as things means that we cannot treat animals as our resources. It does not necessarily mean that we have moral or legal obligations to render them aid or to intervene to prevent harm from coming to them." End quote. Other animal rights theorists likewise argue that while we have a perfect duty not to violate the basic rights of others, human or animal, we only have imperfect or discretionary duties to assist others in need. In general, our negative obligations to others, not to kill, confine, torture, enslave them, or rob them of the necessities of life, are compossible, that is, these obligations do not conflict with one another. Fulfilling my duty not to kill one person does not make it impossible to fulfill the same duty with respect to another person. Many positive obligations, on the other hand, are not compossible. Assisting one animal in relation to one potential harm is likely to compete with other ways of helping other animals. With my limited time and funds, I can support some assistance projects, but not all, and this constrains any prima facie duty to intervene, limiting them perhaps to cases where intervention is close by, low risk, and well known. This idea that positive duties to assist are only weak and imperfect is often accompanied by a concentric circles model of positive duties. In this model, found in Callicott, Wenz, and Palmer, our moral duties are determined by our emotional, spatial, or causal proximity to those in need. Those animals who are close to us, such as our companion animals, are owed positive duties, but those animals who are remote from us, such as wild animals, are owed only negative duties of non-harm. These various responses suffer from two fatal problems. First, they save the laissez-faire intuition towards wild animals only by dramatically weakening our moral obligations to aid humans in distress. It may be true that we have a greater obligation to prevent injustice than to prevent misfortune, but surely we do indeed have a strong obligation to rescue a drowning person at a beach, or to save someone from being hit by a falling rock, even though these are natural misfortunes and not acts of injustice. Francione may be right that American law does not currently impose such good Samaritan obligations towards humans in distress, but other jurisdictions do, and these are widely seen as genuine moral obligations, not merely discretionary options. Similarly, it may be true that we have stronger obligations to help those close by, but surely we have positive obligations to help people suffering in distant countries. I may have no personal connection to people starving in a remote country, and no causal responsibility for their plight, but their remoteness does not absolve me from the positive duties to assist. It would be perverse to try to defend the laissez-faire intuition vis-à-vis wild animals by weakening our general moral obligation to aid those in distress from natural misfortune, or those whose suffering is remote from us, whether geographically or causally. Second, these responses do not actually get to the heart of the issue, since the objection to animal rights theory is not that it would make intervening in nature to help wild animals obligatory, but that it would encourage and praise such intervention. Most of us would think it's a good thing, even if not legally mandatory, to help a distressed human fellow citizen on the street. Yet most of us think it is a bad thing to systematically intervene in predator-prey relationships. We simply should not be trying to physically separate lions from antelope to make sure the former can never prey on the latter. Treating aid to wild animals as merely discretionary rather than obligatory fails to capture this feeling. The animal rights theory response says that aid is permissible rather than obligatory, but the critics argue that intervention should, at least in some cases, be seen as impermissible. We ought not to intervene, even when it is in our discretionary power to do so. Several animal rights theorists, therefore, have attempted to show why there are good reasons, from within an animal rights theory perspective, to limit our interventions in nature. Of course, to be consistent with animal rights theory, any such argument must start from the premise that there are prima facie moral reasons to reduce animal suffering. Since the moral basis of animal rights theory is the recognition that animals have a subjective experience of the world, it clearly matters morally what this experience is. Insofar as natural processes such as food cycles or predation cause suffering, these processes are not benign or sacred. However, there are a variety of both principled and pragmatic reasons why any duties to intervene are likely to be highly limited in the case of wild animals. We now briefly discuss two of these limitations. The fallibility argument. Perhaps the most common argument invokes the enormous fallibility of human interventions in nature. When humans have attempted to intervene in nature, the results have often been not just unintended, but perverse. Consider all the cases of deliberate species introductions that have resulted in serious ecological impacts, or the many alleged scientific management techniques that have led to disaster. For example, H.J.L. Orford describes, quote, why the cullers got it wrong, end quote, in the national parks of Namibia. Their culling interventions were based on an inaccurate model of static animal populations, whereas evolution is based on huge variations of population explosion and collapse, in which both extremes are critical for the creation of habitat and conditions favorable to other creatures in the ecosystem. Natural systems are enormously complex, and our understanding is limited. Under these conditions, it is likely that our interventions will cause as much harm as good, and quite possibly a great deal more. This fallibility argument is a strong one. It is indeed difficult to predict the effects of our interventions. If you can save a deer by scaring off a pack of wolves, that seems like a clear benefit. But what if the wolves starve? Or what if they kill a younger, healthier deer over the next hill? Or what if the deer you have just rescued from a terrifying but quick death will now slowly starve through the long food-scarce winter, or suffer the effects of a prolonged wasting disease? And here we're just talking about our ignorance concerning small-scale or isolated interventions. If we think about human intervention on a larger scale, then the risks of interference expand dramatically. Our past manipulations of ecosystems, introduction of invasive species, or destruction of keystone species, for example, should make us humble about the complexity of ecosystems and cautious regarding our ability to understand the relevant variables for any particular act of intervention. Consider the example of crocodiles, an apex predator in many African rivers. Fraser discusses how entire ecosystems, such as the Okavango Delta, are collapsing due to the destruction of crocodiles. On one hand, their removal reduces the immediate threat to their prey, such as catfish. On the other hand, the catfish itself is a mid-chain predator, so its unchecked growth spells destruction for countless other species such as tigerfish and bream. Meanwhile, the fish and bird species, herons, storks, and eagles, who normally feed on baby crocodiles are also devastated. The crocodile, with its large body, is vital to maintaining open water channels through the reeds of the delta, vital to many other species. This activity, in addition to the crocodile's role in removing waste and recycling nutrients, is key to maintaining water quality upon which all of the animals of the delta depend. This kind of ecosystem complexity makes it very likely that interventions in predation will, at best, simply relocate suffering, rather than significantly reduce it, and may at worst create perverse effects. Thus, many animal rights theorists believe that ecological interdependencies and the precautionary principle argue against interventions in nature. Any duty we have to intervene to prevent suffering is limited by our obligation not to cause greater suffering. However, as Palmer notes, this fallibility argument still seems to miss the target. It implies that if we just had more information, we should start re-engineering the natural world to prevent wild animals from competing for scarce food or territory, or to separate prey from predators, to give every wild animal its own safe and secure habitat, turning nature into a well-managed zoo in which each animal has its own safe enclosure and guaranteed food source. Perhaps we don't yet know how to do this, but if the only objection were fallibility, then we could at least be starting with small-scale pilot projects in order to build up our knowledge about how to re-engineer nature so as to reduce suffering overall. Indeed, McMahon argues that since human impacts in the wild are already pervasive, we ought to direct our future interventions towards reducing suffering in the natural world. In other words, we can't hide behind the fallibility argument for non-intervention insofar as our impact is already pervasive and unavoidable. The flourishing argument. Neither the discretionary argument nor the fallibility argument gets to the heart of the issue. Most of us reject intervening in the suffering of wild animals, not just on the grounds of fallibility or cost, but on a more principled basis, namely that it undermines the flourishing of wild animals. This flourishing argument is perhaps one of the most important, but also the least developed. How precisely does allowing suffering contribute to flourishing? According to Jennifer Everett, the flourishing of wild animals depends on their being able to act in accordance with their characteristic traits and capacities, which have evolved precisely in relation to the processes of predation. This applies at both the collective and individual levels. Wild animal communities flourish when they are able to self-regulate, and individual animals flourish when they act in accordance with the kind of being they are. Everett describes this in terms of attending to characteristic facts of a creature's nature, arguing that we have, quote, prima facie duties to assist them only insofar as such assistance is necessary as a matter of course for those animals to flourish according to their nature, end quote. We should not intervene to save a deer from a predator because deer, quote, do flourish qua deer without human protection from non-human predators. Indeed, if such assistance was consistently forthcoming, it is questionable whether they could flourish according to their natures, end quote. There is something important here, but it needs qualification and clarification. It is difficult to argue that preventing a deer's death is inimical to her flourishing. She cannot flourish if she's not alive. And indeed, various animal rights theorists have insisted that the flourishing argument cannot rule out all interventions at this level. Everett seems to concede this with her reference to consistent interference. Perhaps it is only systematic intervention that undermines flourishing. Re-engineering nature to turn it into a zoo would make it impossible for deer to flourish according to their natures, but rescuing an individual deer trapped in the ice might not. To invoke the flourishing argument against all such interventions runs dangerously close to sanctifying natural processes as inherently morally good or benign. The fact that a deer's nature has been shaped by processes of predation does not mean that the deer finds fulfillment in being eaten alive. So we need to think more carefully about what kinds of interventions, at which levels, inhibit flourishing. A similar need to distinguish individual interventions and state interventions arises in the human case. We may advocate a duty to assist in individual cases without thinking that the state should take on the role of protector or eliminator of risk. Reagan notes that if one comes across a child being mauled by a tiger, there is a duty to intervene to assist the child, but it doesn't follow that the state has a duty to eradicate all tigers to reduce the threat of mauling. Nor, might we add, does it support a public policy of tagging and tracking all tigers to warn people of their presence, or a policy of forbidding people from entering the forests. People have to live with risk. Eliminating risk would involve a terrible curtailment of freedom, including the freedom to fully develop and explore one's capabilities. Individual action to protect a human child at the moment of harm contributes to her flourishing. Collective action to prohibit the actions or processes that create the risk of harm is likely to undermine human flourishing. So too with animals. Once we recognize this, however, we need to shift our level of analysis to a more relational and political plane. The question is no longer what sorts of obligations we owe wild animals in virtue of their intrinsic capacity for suffering. As we have seen, current animal rights theorists' answers to the question are ad hoc and selective. Rather, we need to ask, what are the appropriate sorts of relations between humans and wild animal communities? In our view, current animal rights theory arguments reflect an implicit recognition of the need to understand this relationship in more political terms, as a relationship between distinct self-governing communities, but fall short of actually spelling out the terms of that relationship. Just as references to a right to property as a way of dealing with the habitat objection gesture at a more political understanding, so too these references to the dangers of excessive intervention indicate that we need to think about wild animal communities as organized and self-governing communities, whose relations to human societies must be regulated through norms of sovereignty and fair interaction. Indeed, we can see glimpses of this idea within the animal rights theory literature. Regan, for example, immediately after his famous comment about, quote, letting animals be, keeping human predators out of their affairs, end quote, goes on to add that we should, quote, allow these other nations to carve out their own destiny, end quote. This suggests that in addition to our duty not to infringe the rights of life of individual animals, we also have a duty to respect their collective autonomy, their ability as, quote, other nations to carve out their own destiny, end quote. Similarly, Nussbaum says that, quote, the very idea of a benevolent despotism of humans over animals, supplying their needs, is morally repugnant. The sovereignty of species, like the sovereignty of nations, has moral weight. Part of what it is to flourish for a creature is to settle certain very important matters on its own, without human intervention, even of a benevolent sort, end quote. Here we can see animal rights theory reaching towards ideas of respect for collective autonomy and sovereignty, not just respect for the rights of individual conscious beings. But neither Regan nor Nussbaum spells out what it would mean to treat wild animals as other nations or as sovereign species, and other passages in their works are hard to reconcile with this picture. In short, animal rights theory's approach to the issues of wild animals is at best underdeveloped. We begin this chapter by describing 4 key ways in which wild animals are vulnerable to human activity: direct intentional violence, habitat encroachment, other inadvertent harms, and positive interventions. Animal rights theory's emphasis on basic rights for all animals provides a powerful check against direct violence. On the remaining issues, however, animal rights theory provides an inadequate framework. Many animal rights theorists state the importance of habitat protection for wild animals, but few have explored how this should be realized. The problem of other inadvertent harms to wild animals has received even less attention. On the question of positive obligations to assist wild animals against predation, natural food cycles, and natural disasters, animal rights theorists have set forth various limits to positive intervention, which are sound as far as they go, but have a selective and piecemeal character. What is lacking is a more systematic theory of relations between humans and wild animal communities, one which ties together the various ad hoc arguments provided to date and goes further in addressing a range of issues and conflicts which animal rights theory has so far ignored. Our approach, outlined in the rest of the chapter, is a theory of sovereignty which recognizes that the flourishing of individual wild animals cannot be separated from the flourishing of communities, and which reframes the rights of wild animals in terms of fair interaction between communities. This has implications across the full range of human-animal interactions. The recognition of animal sovereignty limits our actions in terms of encroaching on wild animal territory, and imposes obligations on us to take reasonable precautions to limit our inadvertent harms to wild animals, for example by relocating shipping lanes or by building animal bypasses into road construction. But it also limits our obligations in terms of positive assistance to wild animals. It restricts the terms on which we can visit sovereign wild animal territory, or share overlapping territory, but at the same time it establishes terms for wild animals entering sovereign human communities. It obligates us to respect the basic rights of animals, but also protects us from violations in return. In other words, a theory of wild animal sovereignty provides an overarching framework for guiding our interactions with wild animals, for understanding the balance of our negative and positive obligations to them, and for doing so in a manner that is sensitive to the differences between the ethical duties of the individual actors on one hand and state-level interventions on the other. Section 2. A sovereignty theory for wild animal communities. As discussed in Chapter 3, ideas of citizenship and sovereignty are core organizing principles for how we understand the rights of individuals and self-determining communities, and our aim is to extend these principles to animals. In Chapters 4 and 5, we focused on the nature of citizenship within self-governing communities, examining how domestic animals have suffered injustices analogous to those of other historically marginalized or subordinated castes or classes, and how citizenship theory offers a framework for addressing these injustices and for building more inclusive political communities embracing all of their members. In this chapter, we focus on the external dimension of relations between self-governing communities. Here, too, we argue wild animals have suffered injustices that are analogous to those suffered by various human communities whose self-government and sovereign control of their territory have historically been denied. There is no need to recount the sad history of colonization and conquest in the human case, by which powerful nations have perpetrated injustices on weaker nations. These acts of aggression, subjugating so-called primitive or uncivilized peoples to colonial rule, were often justified by denying that the victims were worthy of being self-governing. In the Nazi conquest of Eastern Europe, for example, while some groups were targeted for wholesale extermination, Jews and Roma, other peoples such as the Poles, Ukrainians, and other Slavs were stripped of their national sovereignty, reducing them to something like feudal serfs or slaves. In other cases of conquest, existing inhabitants such as indigenous peoples were in an important sense simply rendered invisible. Australia's colonizers famously conceived that continent as terra nullis, a territory empty of human or other citizens. Confronted with such injustices, the international community has developed an evolving system of international law intended to safeguard weaker nations from domination by stronger nations. This involves both recognizing the sovereignty of nations and hence criminalizing invasion or colonization, and also articulating a series of principles to regulate the interaction between nations, including fair terms of trade and cooperation, the creation of supranational institutions to address cross-border conflicts arising from pollution or migration, for example, and establishing rules for legitimate external intervention in the case of failed states or gross human rights violations. These form the heart of an evolving system of the, quote, law of peoples, end quote, or international justice. All of these aspects of state-to-state relations are highly contested and constantly evolving. They are a work in progress in response to centuries of conquest and exploitation in which humans have simply enjoyed raw power to seize new territory, whether to settle or to extract resources, without regard for the existing inhabitants who have been killed, displaced, enslaved, or colonized. In our view, wild animals have been subjected to similar sorts of injustices, for which similar sorts of international norms are needed. As Jennifer Wolk notes, the justifications given for colonizing animal habitat are strikingly similar to the terra nullis justifications for the colonizing of indigenous lands. Quote, in mainstream urban theory, urbanization transforms empty land through a process called development to produce improved land, whose developers are exhorted, at least in neoclassical theory, to dedicate it to the highest and best use. Such language is pervasive. Wild lands are not empty, but teeming with non-human life. Development involves a thorough denaturalization of the environment. Improved land is invariably impoverished in terms of soil quality, drainage, and vegetation, and judgments of highest and best use reflect profit-centered values and the interests of humans alone. End quote. Even when it is acknowledged that wild lands have animal inhabitants, these inhabitants are not seen as having a right of sovereign control and occupation with respect to the territory they inhabit. For example, a common no-kill solution to the conflict between development and animal-occupied habitat is to relocate animals to different habitat, as though forced relocation were not in itself a rights violation. As Hadley argues, a requirement not to harm animals in the process of development is a significantly weaker protection than respecting their right to property ownership. And as we discussed below, property ownership in turn is weaker than recognition of sovereign territorial rights. In the human case, these injustices, terra nullius doctrines, and relocation practices, are firmly prohibited by international law. Consider the involuntary relocation of peoples from their homelands. Let's say I want to develop land parcel A. It is currently occupied by an indigenous community, so I round up the inhabitants and relocate them to land parcel B, which is currently occupied by a different community. The inhabitants of neither location have been consulted about this reassignment of citizenship. Parcel A citizens have been robbed of their homeland and turned into refugees. Parcel B inhabitants have been swamped with refugees without a say in the matter, quite probably setting the stage for intense resource and cultural conflicts there. In the human case, we immediately recognize what is going on here: brazen theft of land and resources and violations of sovereignty. It doesn't matter how carefully the relocation is handled to, quote, minimize harm, end quote. We simply don't have the right to take control over lands already occupied by others. Yet neither international law nor political theory condemns these brazen injustices in the case of wild animals. Indeed, ironically, the very international laws adopted to uphold sovereignty in the human case seem to condone the denial of animal sovereignty. Our proposal is that, as in the human case, these intercommunity injustices are best addressed by extending rights of sovereignty to wild animals, and by defining fair terms of interaction amongst sovereign communities. We'll spell out the details below, but to begin with, it may help to contrast our model with a stewardship model found in some environmentalist literature and in some public policy. In this model, habitat is set aside for wild animals in the form of wildlife sanctuaries, refuges, or a national park system. These wild areas are under the management or stewardship of humans, and for the shared benefit of both humans and animals. Human access and use might be strictly limited, not as a recognition of animal sovereignty, but rather as an exercise of human management. This stewardship may be relatively interventionist or relatively hands-off, but either way the relationship is conceptualized as one in which a human sovereign community has set aside a territory for a specific use, and to which the human community retains the right to unilaterally redefine boundaries and use. On a sovereignty model, by contrast, recognizing other communities' sovereign territory involves recognizing that we have no right to govern that territory, let alone to make unilateral decisions by stewards on behalf of wards. As citizens of one state, we may be free to visit and even inhabit the territory of a different sovereign state, but we are not free to control, settle, or unilaterally reshape it according to our needs and desires or our conception of its needs and desires. A Canadian visitor to Sweden is free to move around the country and to enjoy its many pleasures, but she does not possess the rights of citizenship. She cannot set up shop, change the laws, vote, demand services in French and English, or access state benefits. Swedish citizens determine the shape of their own society and set the terms upon which others may visit. Similarly, when we talk of recognizing wild animals' sovereign rights to habitat, we are not talking about creating parks where humans retain sovereign authority, exercising stewardship over animals in nature. We are talking about relations between sovereign entities resting on similar claims to authority. This means that if and when we humans visit their territory, we do so not in the role of stewards and managers, but as visitors to foreign lands. In this respect, the problems with the stewardship model towards wild animals are similar to the wardship model we discussed in Chapter 5 with respect to domesticated animals. In each case, the fundamental problem is the treatment of animals as incompetent and as passive recipients of our benign or harmful actions. A sovereignty model for wild animals, like a citizenship model for domesticated animals, focuses instead on the capacity of animals to pursue their own good and to shape their own communities. Recognizing the sovereignty of territorial-based community means recognizing that people inhabiting the territory have a right to be there and to determine the shape of their communal life, and that they have the ability to do so. This recognition means that a sovereign community has the right to be free both from colonization, invasion, and exploitation on the one hand, and also from external paternalistic management on the other. Sovereign peoples have the right to make their own decisions about the nature of their communal life, providing these do not infringe on the rights of other sovereign nations. This includes the right to make mistakes and to follow paths that outsiders might see as misguided. The autonomy of sovereign nations is not absolute in either the human or the animal case. There are many conditions under which outside assistance or intervention might be appropriate. We will discuss many such cases in relation to wild animals. However, as a general principle, a theory of sovereignty recognizes the importance for peoples as individuals of leading self-determined lives, which, in turn, influences and constrains how we respond to their suffering. The idea of animal sovereignty will undoubtedly strike many readers as unfamiliar, and perhaps as deeply counterintuitive. And indeed, the idea of animal sovereignty is a non sequitur according to some definitions. Sovereignty is defined as a supreme or absolute authority to make law, where law is understood as something separate from mere custom, habit, or social convention. Understood this way, sovereignty requires the existence of an authority structure that, quote, stands apart from and over the community, end quote, since, quote, it is only with the emergence of this type of command structure that we find an institution in which the concept of sovereignty can be lodged, end quote. Much of social life is regulated in tacit and informal ways, through socialization, tradition, the influence of peers, bargaining and fighting amongst individual group members, and so on. But sovereignty is said to be categorically different. It arises, quote, through the establishment of a governing authority that can be differentiated from society and which is able to exercise an absolute political power, end quote. In this sense, sovereignty, quote, stands in opposition to all that is merely mechanical or spontaneous in social development, end quote. Defined this way, it is clear that animal communities lack the institutions needed for sovereignty. The self-regulation of wild animal communities may not be, quote, merely mechanical or spontaneous, end quote, but it is tacit and informal, not based on the promulgation of explicit legal commands by an authority separate from society. We believe that this definition of sovereignty is unduly narrow, and not just in the human case. It is too narrow to address the legitimate claims of human communities. So we will first discuss why we need a broader and more flexible account of sovereignty in the human case, and then discuss why this broader account can and should be generalized to wild animal communities. If only societies with complex institutional differentiation are entitled to claim sovereignty, then some human communities will fail to pass the threshold. Indeed, most human communities throughout history have been stateless societies governed by custom. Does that mean that they have no valid claim to sovereignty? This was the view adopted by European imperialists. When Europeans colonized the Americas, they denied this was a violation of the sovereignty of indigenous peoples on the grounds that indigenous peoples lacked any concept or practice of sovereignty. No individual or institution within indigenous communities was seen as having absolute political power to issue legal commands binding on all members. Their self-regulation was seen to be, quote, mechanical or spontaneous, end quote. This imperialist use of theories of sovereignty to dispossess indigenous people of their lands and autonomy was not just an accident. Theories of sovereignty were developed precisely in order to justify the colonization of indigenous peoples. A basic impetus for the elaboration of theories of sovereignty, and indeed of international law, was more generally to justify why European rulers should treat each other in one way, as civilized peoples to be treated with equality and consent, while treating non-Europeans in a very different way, as inferiors to be conquered and colonized. Theories of sovereignty were a move within this imperial game. Some critics argue that such Eurocentric ideologies and hierarchies are inherent in any use of the term sovereignty, which should therefore be given up by anyone interested in justice for indigenous peoples. In this view, indigenous peoples shouldn't respond to their colonization by asserting indigenous sovereignty, but rather by repudiating the very idea of sovereignty. Others argue that even within its original European homeland, sovereignty is increasingly obsolete. The emergence of international human rights laws and new forms of transnational governments, such as the EU, make the idea of an absolute political power meaningless. Indeed, various critics, including postmodernists, feminists, constructivists, and cosmopolitans, are, quote, convinced of the morally dangerous, conceptually vacuous, or empirically irrelevant character of sovereignty, end quote. Our view, however, is that sovereignty can be rehabilitated and can play a vital role in serving certain moral purposes, but we need to make these moral purposes more explicit. What then are the moral purposes of sovereignty? According to Pemberton, sovereignty is, quote, nothing more than a means of providing a secure space in which communities can grow and flourish. The crucial value at stake is thus autonomy." End quote. This indeed is the view of most recent theorists of the moral purposes of sovereignty. Sovereignty protects autonomy as a means of community flourishing. Insofar as the flourishing of a community's members is tied up with the ability to maintain their own forms of social organization on their territory, then we commit a harm and injustice when we impose alien rule on them, and sovereignty is the tool we use to protect against that injustice. Viewed this way, the moral impulse of sovereignty is fundamentally anti-imperialist, and indeed Daniel Philpott argues that the two major historical, quote, revolutions in sovereignty, end quote, the Treaty of Westphalia, which first created a recognizable principle of sovereignty, and the post-war decolonization movement, which diffused that principle around the world, were both inspired by struggles for local autonomy against imperial power. Any normatively defensible concept of sovereignty, we believe, must be defined to serve this moral purpose. But if so, then the insistence that communities display a particular command structure in order to qualify for sovereignty is clearly a moral distortion. It fetishizes legal form over moral substance. It should not matter whether indigenous peoples meet some threshold of complex institutional differentiation. What matters is their interest in autonomy. As Pemberton notes, quote, "The mere fact of indigenous peoples' independent existence, as well as the value placed on it as evidenced by their resistance to state capture, should have been enough to establish their entitlement to be left alone." End quote. Stateless societies may not have developed in the high modernist European concept of sovereignty, but, quote, "nor could such peoples have been seen in good faith as mere numerical quantities, bereft of social organization and recognizable interests." End quote. Where peoples have an independent existence, place value on it, and resist alien rule, and where they have recognizable interests in their social organization, then we have the moral purposes that call for sovereignty. In short, when evaluating whether and how to accord rights to sovereignty to particular communities, what matters is not the legal institutions they happen to possess, but rather whether they have interests in autonomy, which in turn depends on whether their flourishing is tied to their ability to maintain their modes of social organization and self-regulation beyond their territory. It is clear that in the human case, such interests extend beyond those societies with specifically modern state forms. And so we see a clear trend towards developing new conceptions of sovereignty for indigenous peoples, nomadic peoples, and pastoralists that can operate within or across the boundaries of nation-states. We can see a similar need to reconceptualize sovereignty in relation to the range of protectorates or dependencies. Throughout history, smaller or vulnerable communities have sought protection by associating themselves with larger ones for certain purposes, while insisting on their rights of internal self-government. A number of such cases remain around the world. While theorists of sovereignty puzzle about whether such communities have relinquished their sovereignty, and the UN's Commission on Non-Self-Governing Territories sometimes encourages such communities to reassert full-blown independence, there is no reason why such arrangements cannot be responsive to the underlying moral purposes of sovereignty. We see similar innovations occurring within Europe, as people try to make sense of the way a sovereignty is being unbundled and rebundled at different levels of the European Union, with no single level being able to assert undisputed primacy. In these cases, we need to stop making a fetish of particular legal forms, and instead start by asking about the moral purposes that claims to sovereignty might serve, and then thinking about which forms or modes of sovereignty in fact serve those purposes. The result will inevitably be a rather disparate set of arrangements, in which sovereignty will be nestled, pooled, and shared in various forms of autonomies, dependencies, protectorates, confederations, and associations. In our view, all of this has definite implications for wild animals. Like stateless human communities, they lack the concept of sovereignty and may lack the sort of institutional differentiation that separates state from society. But like human communities, they cannot be, quote, seen in good faith as mere numerical quantities, bereft of social organization and recognizable interests, end quote. They too have an independent existence and have demonstrated the value they attach to it by resisting alien rule. Like human communities, their communal flourishing depends on securing their lands and autonomy. Indeed, the extent to which their well-being depends on maintaining specific traditional habits is arguably greater for most wild animals than for humans. Hence, they too should be seen as being, quote, entitled to being left alone, end quote. In short, once we make explicit the moral purpose of sovereignty, then we have no grounds for denying that wild animals qualify. Wild animals have legitimate interests in maintaining their social organization on their territory. They are vulnerable to the injustice of having alien rule imposed on them and their territory, and sovereignty is an appropriate tool for protecting that interest against vulnerability to injustice. Insisting on a particular command structure as a requirement for sovereignty is morally arbitrary in both the human and the animal case. No doubt, some readers will respond that there remains a fundamental difference between stateless human societies and wild animal communities. The former may not have an institutionally distinct legal order, but they are capable of rational reflection on their self-governance. Even if sovereignty does not require statehood, surely it at least requires some capacity for rational reflection and self-conscious decision-making. For sovereignty to be worth according or respecting, it must involve more than the, quote, merely mechanical or spontaneous, end quote, expression of instinctive behavior. Even if imperialists were wrong to insist that indigenous peoples meet Eurocentric standards of civilization, surely there are some standards of competence that claimants must meet. We hope that our discussion of animal capacities for citizenship in Chapter 5 has already allayed some of these objections. As we discussed, it's a mistake to assume that animals are incapable of agency, but our discussion there was focused on the sort of agency that is possible for domesticated animals within mixed human-animal communities. Domesticated animals, we argue, are capable of expressing a subjective good that can and should be included in our political decisions about the common good. But this was tied to an idea of dependent agency, in which humans played an active role in interpreting this subjective good, and thereby enabling the exercise of animal co-citizenship, an idea which is itself dependent on the sort of relations of trust between animals and humans that domestication presupposes. If we accord sovereignty to wild animals, by contrast, we are precisely rejecting this model of dependent agency. We are saying that individual wild animals do not want or need human assistance to interpret their good. Obviously, the sort of competence required here is different from the competence involved in the exercise of co-citizenship by domesticated animals. If wild animals are to be accorded sovereignty, we need to show that they are competent to take care of themselves and to manage their communities independently, separate from humans, which is very different from the competence for dependent agency within mixed communities. What sort of competence is needed for sovereignty? We would argue that for wild animals, as indeed for humans, what matters for sovereignty is the ability to respond to the challenges that a community faces, and to provide a social context in which its individual members can grow and flourish. And in this sense, it seems clear that wild animals are competent. Sometimes this competence is mechanical and spontaneous, as when animals respond at an instinctual level to their bodily urges, and to the opportunities, challenges, and changes in their environment. And sometimes this competence is consciously learned, as when the bears in Yellowstone Park learned how to open the doors of minivans by bouncing on the roof, and passed this learning on to other bears. Wild animals are competent both as individuals and as communities. As individuals, they know what foods to eat, where to find them, and how to store them for winter use. They know how to find or construct shelter. They know how to care for their young. They know how to navigate vast distances. They know how to reduce the risk of predation, vigilance, hiding, diversion, and counterattack, and to guard against wastage of energy. For example, when deer flee a potentially dangerous human, they run just far enough to be out of the human sightlines, but don't waste energy fleeing any further than necessary. And wild animals are competent as communities as well, at least among the social species. They know how to work together to hunt, or to evade predators, or to care for weak and injured members of the group. New knowledge travels quickly amongst conspecifics. For example, ravens share information about food sources at the nightly roost. A blue tit learns how to pierce the foil of milk bottles, and soon all the neighborhood blue tits are using this new technique for raiding the cream layer from the top of milk bottles delivered to the front doorsteps in Britain. Some wild animals cooperate across the species divide, as is the case of the cooperative scavenging relationship between ravens and coyotes, described in Chapter 4, or cooperative hunting between grouper fish and moray eels. In these and other countless ways, wild animals, both individually and collectively, confront the challenges of life in the wild, successfully tending to their needs and minimizing risks. In this sense, as Reagan emphasizes, it is wrong to equate wild animals with defenseless children needing our protection. Wild animal communities include animals of all ages and levels of competence. As parents and communities, they socialize their young and pass on the competence necessary for survival. There may be circumstances in which outside assistance from humans would be helpful and desirable, for example, in the case of a large-scale natural disaster or a ravaging and preventable disease, or in response to individual animals in distress. We will discuss such cases below. But in general, when it comes to day-to-day management of the risks of living in the wild, it is reasonable to view wild animals as competent actors in a division of labor in which they take responsibility for mutual assistance in their own communities, and indeed are much more competent to do so than we would be on their behalf. Someone might respond that wild animals are hardly competent to exercise sovereignty if they are unable to protect all of their own members from starvation or predation. If a human community failed in this regard, we would likely view it as a failed state, or in any event one that requires some degree of external intervention. But in the context of ecosystems, food cycles and predator-prey relationships are not indicators of failure. Rather, they are defining features of the context within wild animal communities exist. They frame the challenges to which wild animals must respond, both individually and collectively, and the evidence suggests that they respond competently. This competence argument is more compelling in relation to some animals than to others. Many mammalian species produce few offspring and invest greatly in their care either as individual parents or larger social groups. Individual young have a real chance of surviving this challenge of their early years and making it to adulthood. Compare this with the many amphibian and reptile species who lay vast quantities of eggs and leave them to fend for themselves. Most eggs never hatch. Most hatchlings are quickly consumed by predators. Life for many a fish, turtle, or lizard amounts to a few brief seconds after emerging from the shell until a larger fish or bird or reptile swoops in to devour them. The scope for competent agency varies across species, but it should be recognized and supported where it does exist. For some species, it grounds a strong argument for respecting autonomy. For other species, the argument is weaker. On balance, however, we should still respect the sovereignty of wild animals, including those for whom there is minimal evidence of competent agency, because the argument is strongly buttressed by the earlier arguments about fallibility and flourishing. Given the complexity and interdependencies of natural processes and our very fallible understanding of them, there is every reason to assume that any paternalistic intervention we undertake to protect wild animals will have unintended and perhaps perverse effects. And if this paternalistic intervention takes place on a broad scale, it is almost certainly going to undermine the ability of wild animals to exercise the capacities and dispositions that evolved precisely in response to their environment. If we are to respect wild animals as members of their own communities, autonomous and self-regulating, then interference in the defining features of their form of community would mean an end to their independence, to their ability to be the sorts of beings they are, and to put them instead in a state of dependency on ongoing human intervention. Moreover, it's important to note that insofar as we can assess their preferences, wild animals do not accede to such interventions. Wild animals, as we define them, are precisely those animals who avoid human contact. Unlike domesticated animals who have been bred for human environments, or the liminal animals we will discuss in Chapter 7 who seek out human development and the opportunities afforded there, wild animals show a clear preference to be independent of humans. We could say that, on the sovereignty question, they vote with their feet, and insofar as they exhibit no inclination to join into society with us, we must respect them as forming their own sovereign communities. In our view, this presumption of competence amongst wild animals and their demonstrated antipathy to human intervention is sufficient to establish their claim to be recognized as having legitimate sovereign authority. This may seem like a roundabout way of getting back to where we started, namely the long-standing animal rights theory view that in relation to wild animals, we should simply let them be. But as we have seen, the arguments animal rights theory has invoked for this view are rather ad hoc and underdeveloped, and the recognition of sovereignty provides a more secure normative conceptual basis for it. Moreover, animal rights theory has not explained how to let them be. Respecting autonomy is a valid moral purpose, but we need legal and political tools to do so. As we noted earlier, some animal rights theorists have suggested that we can protect wild animals through the attribution of property rights. But if we think again about the example of European imperialism, we can see the limits of this approach. European imperialists were often quite prepared to accept that indigenous peoples had property rights, even as they denied them sovereignty. The result was that indigenous individuals or families were able to maintain a plot of land but lost their collective autonomy, as Europeans imposed their own laws, culture, and language on indigenous peoples. Similarly, what wild animals need is not only a property right in an individual nest or den, say, but rather protection of their right to maintain their way of life on their territory. In short, they need sovereignty. Moreover, respect for sovereignty is not just an injunction to let them be, in either the human or the animal case. Respect for sovereignty does not require isolation or autarky, but it rather is consistent with forms of interaction and assistance, and even with forms of intervention. This is clear enough in the human case, where self-governing communities exercise their sovereignty by entering into dense webs of mutual cooperation and mutual agreements, including agreements over the rules of humanitarian intervention. But even in the wild animal case, it is a mistake to think that respect for sovereignty requires a complete hands-off approach. Not all forms of human intervention threaten values of autonomy and self-determination. On the contrary, some forms of positive intervention may promote them. Imagine that human intervention could halt an aggressive and systemic new bacterium which is about to invade and devastate an ecosystem. Or imagine that human intervention could deflect a large meteor on a collision course for a wilderness zone populated by billions of wild animals. In these cases, and others we discuss below, human intervention can be seen as protecting the ability of wild animals to maintain their way of life on their territories. More generally, sovereignty provides a framework within which we can address a range of issues that inevitably rise between communities, such as issues of boundaries and spillover effects, as well as the legitimate scope for intervention. As we noted at the start of this chapter, the traditional animal rights theory injunction to let them be provides little or no guidance on these questions. Indeed, we believe that these questions simply cannot be addressed within any version of animal rights theory that focuses solely on the issue of individual capacities and interests. Any attempt to address questions of territory, boundaries, spillover effects, and intervention solely by reference to universal individual rights will inevitably fall prey to the too little, too much dilemma that we noted earlier. However, all of these questions become more tractable when they are situated within a larger framework of just relations between sovereign communities. That, at any rate, is what we try to show in the rest of this chapter, by examining a series of concrete issues concerning the relations between humans and wild animals. As with our citizenship model in Chapter 5, invoking theories of sovereignty does not provide a magic formula for resolving some very thorny questions. But we try to show that sovereignty does provide a useful lens for addressing these issues, offering more coherent and compelling answers than those available in existing animal rights theory or ecological approaches. We start with the issue of intervention, to explore how ideas of sovereignty can both justify a general presumption against colonization or paternalistic management, while also providing criteria for acceptable forms of intervention that support sovereignty. We then turn to the issue of boundaries and territory and spillover effects. Section 3. Positive assistance and intervention. As we noted earlier, one fundamental challenge facing animal rights theory concerns the question of positive obligations to wild animals. On the one hand, if we recognize animals as vulnerable selves, then surely their pain and suffering matters, even when caused by natural processes, and we should do what we can to mitigate or eliminate such suffering. This suggests, in Nussbaum's words, that animal rights theory should aim, quote, in a very general way for the gradual supplanting of the natural by the just, end quote. On the other hand, the idea that we have a duty to intervene to provide food and safe shelter to wild animals seems a reductio of the very idea of animal rights. Confronted with this dilemma, animal rights theorists have offered a variety of arguments in favor of the laissez-faire intuition that we should just let wild animals be, including arguments about autonomy, flourishing, fallibility, and discretion. However, these arguments often have a rather ad hoc appearance and do not necessarily fit together in any clear or coherent fashion. Moreover, as soon as we think about the full range of possible interventions, the idea that we could have a single simple rule, whether an interventionist commitment to, quote, supplant the natural by the just, end quote, or a non-interventionist commitment to let them be, seems implausible. There are important variations between different types of interventions, some of which may be more permissible than others, and we need a version of animal rights theory that can capture the moral significance of these variations. Not all human interventions in wild animal societies threaten their autonomy or habitat. Some human activity in a wild animal territory might be benign, appreciation of the wilderness, or moderate resource extraction, such as sustainable collection of wild foods like nuts, fruits, mushrooms, seaweeds, etc., leaving enough and as good for others. Some interventions might actually be positively beneficial, as for example when selective logging increases light and air circulation in a closed forest environment in a way that enriches the ecosystem and benefits the animals living there. Although wild animals avoid human contact, they can sometimes benefit from the actions of humans, as for example when an individual animal is rescued after breaking through thin ice, or provided with emergency food or shelter. Such small-scale interventions seem benign, and some large-scale interventions also seem desirable, such as the meteor deflection that we mentioned earlier. We need to be very careful in justifying interventions into wild animal communities, but this does not mean that all interventions are illegitimate. Unfortunately, current versions of animal rights theory provide virtually no guidance in deciding which forms of intervention are appropriate. Can a theory of sovereignty for wild animals do better? Obviously, sovereignty will not help if it is just a fancy word for letting them be. But we have argued that sovereignty is more than that. It is rooted in a distinct set of moral purposes. Sovereignty is tied to a particular set of interests. Communities have legitimate interests in maintaining their social organization on their territory. And to a particular set of threats. Communities are vulnerable to the injustice of having alien rule imposed on them and their territories. Sovereignty is an appropriate tool for protecting this particular set of interests against that particular vulnerability to injustice. Viewed this way, sovereignty is a far richer moral notion than simply letting them be. Respect for sovereignty is not about isolation or autarky, and does not forbid all forms of interaction or even intervention. What matters rather is upholding the value of self-determination, and while this rules out certain forms of intervention, it allows and perhaps even requires other forms of assistance. The rules for distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate interventions in sovereign communities are highly contested, even in the human case. But we can identify some basic principles. On the one hand, sovereign communities have the right to protection from the aggression of foreign states, conquest, colonization, theft of resources, and from less violent forms of imperialism, paternalistic management or intervention in their internal affairs by outsiders, whether well-meaning or not. In other words, sovereignty is a form of protection against external threats of annihilation, exploitation, or assimilation. It provides the space for communities to develop along their own self-determining paths, under controlled conditions of interaction with outsiders, rather than being subjected to the unchecked force of powerful outsiders, regardless of the intentions of these outsiders. However, it is not the goal of sovereignty to rule out all interactions between states. There are many potential benefits from mutual cooperation between states in terms of trade, increased mobility, and importantly, the possibilities of positive assistance. As a result, there are many instances in which states actively solicit the positive help of foreign states. Arrangements of mutual aid may be formalized in treaties or merely cemented over years of interaction and mutual assistance. Such arrangements do not undermine sovereignty. On the contrary, they are ways in which states exercise sovereignty on behalf of their citizens. A much thornier area is positive intervention that is not solicited or part of an agreed mutual agreement, as when a state is suddenly overwhelmed by an external threat, a natural calamity, or internal collapse. We usually consider that the international community has a duty to help in these situations, even if the afflicted state is not in a position to formally solicit assistance. But intervention to help others who have not requested our help, or in cases where there is a conflict about seeking outside assistance, can be problematic. Claims of providing positive assistance are frequently used to cloak acts of imperialistic power. Consider the invasion of Iraq, for example, or the Nazi invasions of Czechoslovakia and Poland, which were defended on the basis of protecting internal minorities whose state had failed in its duty to protect them. On the other hand, it is generally agreed that the international community should have intervened in Rwanda to protect Tutsis from the sudden and catastrophic failure of that state to protect its citizens. External military interventions to protect basic rights of citizens are perhaps the most difficult issue, since these interventions occur almost inevitably against the wishes of the state government. But aid and assistance in response to natural disaster or failed development are also fraught. International response to the devastating 2004 tsunami in Asia is an example of international assistance which was welcomed by the people and communities in need and was carried out in ways that were effective and non-threatening to the sovereignty of those communities. However, there have been countless examples of so-called aid that are in fact thinly veiled efforts by the states offering assistance to access new markets, control resources, create dependencies, or extort obligations. These issues are enormously complicated in human international relations, and there is no reason to think that they will be any less complicated in human-animal relations. However, we can identify some fundamental principles that are widely shared. First, if the people of a foreign state have suffered or are suffering a catastrophe, whether human-generated or an act of nature, and we are able to assist them, and our efforts to assist are not rejected, then we should indeed assist them to the best of our ability and resources. Second, we should offer assistance in a way that allows a community to get back on its own feet, that is, in a manner that supports its competence and viability as a sovereign state with a right to self-determination. We should not use circumstances of vulnerability to undermine a state's independence, indebt it, weaken it, or impose on it our own conception of the good. These principles are not always easy to implement. There are complexities not just around the question of whether assistance should be provided, but also regarding how it should be provided and by whom. At every stage, assistance can be undertaken in ways that respect the dignity of those being assisted, including their right to be citizens of self-determining communities, or ways that undermine their dignity. However, it seems clear that there are instances of sovereign states being overwhelmed by a catastrophe, for example a natural tragedy, or suffering a total collapse of international order and/or legitimacy, for example a quote-unquote failed state, genocide, etc., where positive intervention is consistent with respecting the sovereignty of the people. Indeed, intervention can be viewed as protecting and helping to restore their sovereignty. In these instances, assuming intervention can be efficacious, we have a duty to assist. We believe that these basic principles can also be applied to wild animal communities. Averting a meteor collision, for example, seems to fall clearly in the category of interventions that respect and help to restore sovereignty. By contrast, intervening to end predation or to control natural food cycles could only be achieved by subverting sovereignty and by reducing wild animals to a state of permanent dependency and paternalism. As we discussed earlier, predation and food cycles are part of the stable structure of self-regulation of wild animal communities. Animals have evolved to survive under these conditions and are competent to do so. Individual animals suffer from these natural processes, but the presence of predation and food cycles does not indicate that the sovereign community has suffered a disabling catastrophe or a sudden failure of competence. Wild animals are not in the circumstances of justice with one another, and the survival of some individuals inevitably requires that other individuals die. This is a regrettable feature of nature, but any attempt to intervene to change these facts of nature en masse would require completely subjugating nature to our ongoing intervention and management. Not only is this impossible, but even if it were possible, it would completely undermine the sovereignty of wild animal communities. Intervention in nature to end predation and food cycles is unjustifiable both in terms of motivation and effect. It does not meet the required trigger for intervention, such as overwhelming catastrophe, community disintegration, and/or requests for external assistance. And it cannot meet the goal of intervention, which is to help a sovereign community get back on its feet as a viable and self-determining community. Respect for sovereignty, therefore, rules out systematic intervention to end predation or natural food cycles, at least insofar as we can currently envision such interventions. However, this leaves open the question of other kinds of positive assistance, ones that do not undermine the very stability of wild animal communities or their ability to exist in the future as sovereign communities. We have already considered some interventions that meet this test, blasting the meteor out of space, or halting a runaway virus in its tracks before it invades a vulnerable ecosystem. These may sound like science fiction scenarios, but we can imagine more prosaic small scale interventions in which humans can benefit wild animal communities without undermining their sovereignty. Scale matters here. As an individual human, I can save a starving deer without upsetting the balance of nature, that is, without compromising the sovereignty of wild animal communities. However, if the government undertakes a large scale deer feeding program, this will have consequences for deer populations, for their predators, for the plants that the deer would otherwise be eating, for their competitors for that food, and so on down the line. Systemic and ongoing human intervention will be required to manage all of these consequences. This means that as individuals or collectivities, we need to weigh our actions in a complex manner. On the one hand, my actions as an individual are unlikely to compromise the sovereignty of wild animal communities. On the other hand, my actions in concert with many others acting in the same way might do so. This does not prohibit me from feeding the deer. I may have fairly reliable knowledge, for example, that there aren't significant numbers of other individuals feeding deer, and that my individual action is harmless in the larger scheme, not one that will snowball towards pervasive human interventions down the road. However, concern about whether I am an individual actor, or one of many, is only one consideration. There is also the fallibility argument. Are my actions, even on an individual level, going to have the consequences that I foresee? Or am I potentially going to cause more harm where I seek to alleviate suffering? Elizabeth Marshall Thomas provides a detailed account of her reasoning process in considering whether or not to feed deer at her New Hampshire home. Some of the potential unintended consequences she considers include disrupting the social relations and power dynamics amongst the local deer community, contributing to diet imbalance, tempting the deer to risk exposure or predators in order to reach her food stations, and encouraging transmission of diseases between deer at the feeding station. On balance, she decides to take as many precautions as she can and goes ahead and feeds the deer. She asks, quote, "Why did I feed these animals against all advice? Because we live in the same space, because they were individuals, because they had relatives, experience, a past, and desires, because they were cold and hungry, because they hadn't found enough to eat in the fall, because each had just one life." End quote. In short, having weighed the consequences of her actions, in the end she is moved by a response of simple compassion. These are deer she has developed an individual relationship with. They are suffering, and she believes she is in a position to help them, so she helps them. Ultimately, in just about any situation of offering positive assistance, we have to trust our judgment as individuals to assess the specific circumstances and to make the right choices. Have I done my homework? Do I know enough about feeding deer to minimize the risk that I might actually harm them? Would my efforts to help others and alleviate suffering be better directed elsewhere? Have I thought about the larger ramifications of my actions and the way they interact with the actions of others? There is a nice description of this kind of dilemma in Hope Ryden's book about her experience with a colony of beavers at Lily Pond in upstate New York. Ryden and the beavers gradually habituate to each other's presence, and she spends months observing them from a companionable distance, compiling some amazing documentation about their habits and social relationships. As a scientist, Ryden wants to observe beavers in their natural state as much as possible, without becoming a significant intervening force in their lives. She wants to observe their lives, not manipulate them. And yet, over the course of months of nighttime observation, when the beavers are most active, she naturally becomes greatly attached to the beavers, and then a crisis occurs. It is late in the winter, and a combination of events, a delayed spring, unusually thick ice, has resulted in the beavers running out of food in their den. Beavers can't escape the den until the ice cover breaks, so if they haven't stored sufficient food at the beginning of the winter, they starve. Ryden can tell from the absence of sounds emitted from the beaver house that they are on their last legs. Ryden agonizes, and she finds she cannot stand by, so she opens up a section of the ice next to the house and brings enough branches to sustain the beavers for a few days until the weather breaks. Despite her adherence to the general principle of non intervention, Ryden finds herself in an individual situation in which she feels she must intervene. Some would say this behavior is contradictory, or a failure of duty on her part, but there is no contradiction, because Ryden is not legislating a universal duty of human intervention in beaver food cycles. Rather, she is in a very specific relationship to particular beavers. She knows them very well, and can understand that her actions are unlikely to have catastrophic spillover effects. Moreover, she has a duty of care that has been activated by her relationship with the beavers, including the many benefits she has drawn from this relationship. Many scientists and naturalists have undertaken amazingly complex projects to assist wild animals, usually those who belong to species at risk. Consider the efforts to help the wall-drap ibis relearn its traditional migration route by following behind humans in a microlight aircraft. The ibis isn't a strong flyer, and the birds are frequently blown off course. So far, several of them have been learning the migration route primarily from the back of a van. We may ask whether the fallibility and discretionary arguments are always sufficiently attended to in these undertakings. That is, are these interventions really causing more good than harm? Would efforts and resources be better directed elsewhere? We may also have concerns about whether the basic rights of the individual animals being assisted, as opposed to the species, are being respected. In other words, are the rights of individuals being compromised in order to benefit the species? These are all important questions. What we should learn from these efforts, though, is that humans are capable of incredibly creative and delicate interventions in the natural world when we put our minds to it. And these interventions, under the right circumstances, can fully respect the rights of animals, both as individuals and as sovereign collectives, while adding immensely to our understanding of them and our ability to help them in the future. A wonderful account of such an intervention is naturalist Joe Hutto's decision to rescue abandoned wild turkey eggs from a farmer's field, incubate and hatch the eggs, and raise the turkeys to live in the wild. Hutto was fully committed to the implications of his decision. He knew that the turkeys would be dependent on him for a full year, not just to supply them with food and shelter, but to help them develop into fully independent creatures able to forage and fend for themselves, without becoming habituated to humans in the process. He set up an enclosure and roost for the turkeys where he could leave them safely at night, and during the day he took on the role of turkey parent, gradually introducing the young turkeys to their surroundings, accompanying them for countless hours of exploration and foraging in the woods and fields. For a year, Hutto lived the life of a wild turkey. He learned how to be in their company, how to move, where to forage, how to attend to changes in the environment, and how to signal snakes, berries, or other notable features. In this way, he could keep a watchful eye on them during their vulnerable early months, while letting them develop a full range of natural wild turkey behaviors and experiences. And within the year, the turkeys were sufficiently weaned and integrated into the wild. Hutto's subsequent written account has added greatly to our understanding and appreciation of wild turkeys. Indeed, it looks like a clear case of a genuinely mutual beneficial relationship. The turkeys have a chance at life which would otherwise have been lost, and not a stunted life in captivity, but a full turkey life. And Hutto has a chance to learn and develop a bond across the species barrier. One could imagine a story starting with the same intervention, rescuing the eggs, but going in a very different direction, resulting in adult turkeys confined to a zoo for life, or so habituated to humans that even though released in the wild, they wouldn't be able to last long. Being drawn to human settlement, they would inevitably meet accidental or intentional harm there. Or one could imagine turkeys inadequately monitored during the vulnerable first months, or ill-prepared for life in the wild, thus becoming easy pickings for the first coyote or hawk to come along. These various grim scenarios remind us of why, in general, a hands-off principle toward wild animals is a sound one. But Hutto's story reminds us that hands-off isn't the only ethical choice for individuals in their relationship with wild animals. Often, ecological theorists have taken a harder line than animal rights theorists regarding the inadmissibility of human interventions in processes of nature. This is strongly motivated by fallibility concerns, i.e., humans will inevitably do more harm than good. But it is also motivated by a strain of anti-sentimentalism. According to this macho strain in ecological thought, nature's laws are harsh, and it is weakness or squeamishness to wish otherwise. Individual acts of compassion towards individual animals can't change the overall framework, so they are a futile form of sentimental sloppiness, even if they don't lead to actual harm to animals or ecology. The desire to carry out such acts betrays a lack of understanding of nature, even a hatred of nature's processes. There are many problems with this view. For starters, it is wrong to suggest that deploring certain aspects of nature, for example, that animals suffer, amounts to a hatred of nature per se. Second, such a view rests on an implicit and indefensible assumption about humans and their actions being outside of nature. Our empathetic response to the suffering of other species is itself part of a human nature, and is a response shared by other species as well, for example, wild dolphins who help to rescue humans. Third, it betrays callousness towards the fate of individuals. The fact that one cannot change natural processes of predation or food cycles, and hence cannot change the fate of animals on a large scale, doesn't mean that acts of caring towards individual animals are irrelevant or inconsistent. Such acts mean everything to the actual animal who has been fed or rescued after falling through the ice. Some ecologists are led into this error because of the way they reify, even sanctify, nature's laws or non-human ecological processes. This is very different from the theory advanced here that animal communities must be respected as sovereign and self-determining. Respect for wild animal sovereignty is not just letting them be. Sovereignty is critical for protecting the freedom, autonomy, and flourishing of wild animals, and in general this means that humans should be very cautious about intervening in nature. However, there are many kinds of assistance that do not compromise wild animal sovereignty. We have canvassed several, from efforts to avert natural disasters to small-scale acts of compassion and assistance, that do not undermine the sovereignty of wild animal communities. Far from being misguided or inconsistent acts of sentimentality, we would argue that these interventions are demanded by compassion as a thoughtful response to another's suffering and justice. As we discussed below, such positive actions of intervention can also help temper the egregious risks and spillover costs we inevitably impose on wild animals. The sovereignty of wild animals helps to explain why we have these two impulses. A. To leave nature in general to its own ways, preserving the space in which animals exercise agency to determine the course of their lives and the future of their communities without humans calling the shots, while B. Nevertheless responding in a time and or scale-limited fashion in order to reduce suffering or avert disaster, having carefully considered the consequences of doing so. These impulses are not inconsistent, but rather a reflection of a careful balancing of important values, autonomy and freedom on the one hand, and the alleviation of suffering on the other, that frequently come into conflict in the wilderness where animals are not in the circumstances of justice with one another. In short, we believe that sovereignty provides an appropriate framework for thinking through our positive obligations to wild animals, one that avoids the gaps and vacillations of existing animal rights theory. We ought not to intervene in the internal workings of wild animal communities, for example, predation or food cycles, in ways that undermine their autonomy, effectively placing them under permanent and systemic human management. However, we have a duty to offer positive assistance when this is consistent with respect for sovereignty and careful weighing of the fallibility and discretionary arguments. These requirements cannot be captured by some simple general formula, such as, quote, always act to reduce suffering, end quote, or, quote, never interfere in nature, end quote. We do not owe obeisance to some kind of sacred law of nature. We owe duties of justice to wild animals. In general, respecting their sovereignty means that we should be very cautious about undertaking interventions in nature. But respect for sovereignty is consistent with undertaking many individual and time-limited or scale-limited acts of assistance which do not undermine the ability of wild animal communities to flourish as independent and self-regulating communities. When we can help animals without usurping their autonomy or causing greater harms, we should be moved by the plight of suffering individuals. Section 4. Boundaries and Territory. So far, we have tried to show how sovereignty for wild animals is a broader and richer notion than the traditional animal rights theory slogan of letting them be, rooted in a more complex set of moral purposes. However, a sovereignty framework is not without its own difficulties. Its moral purposes may be clear, we hope, but how it can be operationalized in practice is less clear. We have been talking so far in a rather loose way about the way norms of sovereignty can regulate interactions between distinct communities, each maintaining its own forms of social organization on its territory. This suggests a picture in which we can neatly divide up the world into discrete communities exercising sovereignty over their discrete territories. Yet this is hardly a realistic picture. Nature did not assign discrete territories to different species. Different wild animal species occupy and compete for the same territory, and many species need to move large distances across territory occupied by other animals or by humans. Sovereignty, therefore, if it is to mean anything in practice, cannot be tied to a picture of neatly divided communities and territories. In the rest of this chapter, therefore, we attempt to address some of the key challenges involved in implementing a sovereignty framework, including issues of boundaries, territory, and spillover effects. The nature of boundaries, shared and overlapping sovereignty. In everyday discourse, when we think of sovereign states, we think of traditional political maps with neat lines separating chunks of territory into defined states. Canada is to the north of the 49th parallel, the US to the south. But of course, it's more complicated than this. State boundaries do not neatly correspond with the boundaries separating nations or peoples with the inherent right to self-determination. Many states are actually multi-nation states, in which sovereignty is shared or overlapping between different nations or peoples, each of whom asserts rights to sovereignty and to self-determination. Within the boundaries of the USA or Canada, we find sub-state nations of various stripes: the Quebecois, Inuit, and First Nations in Canada, American tribes, or Puerto Ricans in the USA. Typically, these instances of sub-state sovereignty are still territorially based. That is, that we can point on the map to lands under the partial or shared sovereignty of different indigenous peoples or minority nations. In this sense, our ideas of sovereignty remain deeply connected to those of homeland or traditional territory. The existences of nations within complicates the linking of sovereignty to territory, but does not replace that link. When we turn to the animal case, the story is more complicated. In the case of some land-based animals, we can think about a form of substate territorial sovereignty. Like Quebec, Sami lands, or Puerto Rico, these would be examples in which the boundaries of a sovereign animal community are contained within or overlap the boundaries of a larger sovereign state encompassing other peoples. But when we think about birds and fish, the relevant boundaries can no longer be defined in simple two-dimensional geographic terms. Creatures of water and air inhabit ecological dimensions that are often secondary in human conceptions of sovereign territory. Moreover, any conception of boundaries must account for the facts of migration. If the function of sovereignty is to protect a community's ability to maintain forms of social organization within which its members can flourish, then we need to recognize that these forms involve migrating across the territory of other species or peoples. Consider some cases. Whitethroat or Sylvia warblers winter in the Sahel region south of the Sahara Desert, and then migrate over Egypt and Western Europe to return to British woodlands each spring. What is their sovereign territory? We might say that their two primary habitats in the Sahel and in Britain constitute their primary sovereign territory, but their ability to enjoy that sovereign territory clearly depends on their right to the use of land and air corridors in between. Some of this habitat is separate from human settlement, but much of it overlaps human sovereign territory, and so we need to account of how sovereignty is shared in those zones. The warblers don't harm us when they fly past, and so in addition to protecting their two primary habitats, we should be prohibited from erecting obstructions along their flight path or degrading the waters and food sources at their vital resting spots. Or consider the northern right whales, who roam between summer habitat off the coasts of New England and Nova Scotia, and winter calving grounds off the coast of Florida and Georgia. This is a perilous migration in light of the dangers of being struck by ships along the very busy eastern seaboard. Here again, we need some way of recognizing the sovereignty of ocean animals while sharing the use of territory. Humans, like warblers and right whales, have a right to migrate, to travel in the business of living. We might conceptualize this in terms of surface travel rights, to travel corridors through sovereign wild animal territory. But this right of way for human travel is a limited right. Humans cannot exercise such a right without regard for those whose territory we are crossing. As it happens in the case of right whales, humans are in fact taking important steps to protect them from deadly ship collisions, such as altering the route of Atlantic shipping lanes and establishing whale monitoring systems to warn ships when they are in proximity to whale pods. In this way, we can say that humans are already recognizing an obligation to respect the sovereignty of whales as a side constraint on their activities as they traverse right whales' habitat. Or consider the countless cases in which human highways cross wild lands in order to link separate human communities. This need not be inherently impermissible, but they should be seen as right-of-way corridors through sovereign wild animal territory. And like ocean shipping lanes, we should be obliged to redesign them in order to limit harms to wild animals. We cannot exercise our right to mobility at the expense of their right to life and mobility. This might mean rethinking our highways in many ways, relocating them away from large wildlife populations, creating buffer zones, travel corridors, and tunnels, lowering speed limits, and redesigning cars. Respect for sovereignty is likely to involve some mix of designated territories and corridor/right-of-way rights. And this is true for both humans and animals. Just as humans need corridors through wild animal territory, wild animals need corridors through regions of intensive human settlement in order to be able to respond flexibly to population pressures, climate change, and so on. Developing a framework of sovereignty that can accommodate these complexities is not easy. However, there are interesting analogies and precedents in the human case. We can find many cases where pastoralists, nomads, and ethnic or religious minorities have been accorded land corridors, rights of way, buffer zones, and shared sovereignty, so as to preserve access to their traditional destinations, seaports, sacred sites, or co-ethnics. For example, consider the situation of nomadic peoples such as the Roma, Bedouin, Sami, and countless others whose traditional migration patterns take them across modern state boundaries. In the case of nomadic peoples and other communities divided by international boundaries, these facts of membership cut across international borders, and efforts have been made to develop new forms of citizenship to recognize this. Some of these peoples are stateless, some are citizens in one area and visitors elsewhere, yet others have forms of multiple citizenship. It's a work in progress, but human political theory is slowly developing new concepts for thinking about sovereignty and citizenship in ways that accommodate rather than deny or suppress the overlapping and mobile character of communities and territories. This will obviously require abandoning the idea that sovereignty must be univocal and absolute. Human and animal sovereignty will necessarily involve some degree of parallel sovereignty. Sovereignty is importantly tied to territory, since a community, especially most animal communities, cannot be ecologically viable, let alone autonomously self-regulating, without a land base to sustain it. But sovereignty need not be defined in terms of exclusive access or control over a particular territory, but rather in terms of the extent or nature of access and control necessary for a community to be autonomous and self-regulating. Consider the case of bonobos and humans sharing the forests to the south of the Congo River. One way of recognizing bonobo sovereignty would be to set aside a sizable part of the forest and simply exclude humans, including those peoples who have traditionally inhabited the region for generations and whose way of life is tied to the land. This indeed has been the approach taken by some international conservation organizations. But dispossessing these humans in order to meet the claims of bonobos is an injustice. One solution to this problem has been compensation, that is, compensating dispossessed humans with land and opportunities elsewhere. But a better solution might be to recognize bonobos and local human communities as sharing overlapping territory in this region. While bonobos have come under terrible pressure in recent history due to war, resource development, and the bushmeat trade, there are examples of traditional societies who have lived sustainably and harmoniously side by side with bonobos for generations, and for whom harming them is taboo. There is no reason why such societies cannot coexist peacefully, sharing the land and its resources, each pursuing its independent course, providing the human footprint remains in balance. In relation to one another, sovereignty is shared or overlapping, but in relation to the outside world, their joint sovereignty can protect both parties from external interference and incursions, for example, invasion, settlement, violence, development, or resource extraction by external human actors. Of course, the Democratic Republic of Congo is home to countless other animal species as well, all connected in a complex ecological web. Thus, we should think in terms of sovereign communities of multi-species animal ecologies rather than a single species. Here again we can find human equivalents. Various countries have endorsed the principle that indigenous peoples or national groups have inherent rights to self-determination, but in cases where such groups are either too small to govern themselves effectively, and or are geographically interspersed with other such groups, the solution has been to create multi-ethnic autonomy regimes in which a single geographic entity is seen as the vehicle for protecting and advancing the sovereignty of different peoples. We see these, for example, in Mexico, Nicaragua, and Ethiopia. Whether we conceive of a particular territory as a sovereign single multi-species community or a series of overlapping sovereign communities, the key point is that the territory is protected from external alien rule or depredations and free internally to evolve along its own autonomous course. In short, sovereignty need not be conceived in terms of strict geographical segregation. Sharing the world with animals would involve a variety of sovereign relationships. In some cases, there would be strict territorial separation, that is, wilderness areas with very restricted access for humans. There might be other areas in which sovereignty is shared by particular communities of humans and animals, but is restricted with respect to outsiders. There may be other contexts in which sovereignty is conceived multidimensionally in order to accommodate migration patterns and travel corridors or other kinds of shared use. To make room for such options, our conception of the boundaries of wild animal sovereignty must not be tied to an overly simplistic concept or territory, like the boundaries of a national park. It needs to be a more multi-layered conception of sovereignty which can account for A, ecological viability, B, the multidimensionality of territory, C, the facts of human and animal mobility, and D, the possibilities for sustainable and cooperative parallel cohabitations. Drawing boundaries, the fair allocation of territory. While not reducible simply to lines on a map, the recognition of sovereignty for animals and humans does require drawing boundaries. Even if the sovereignty of various wild animal and human communities can be overlapping in places, we still need some way of determining which animal and human communities have the right to be on which pieces of territory. But where should we draw the boundaries of sovereign human and animal communities? This is a major challenge for political theory of animal rights, in part because it is a major unresolved challenge for political theory in the human case. In Avery Kohler's words, the issue of territorial rights is a, quote, shocking blind spot, end quote, in contemporary political philosophy, and indeed its, quote, most dangerous, end quote, omission. It is clear in the human case that we cannot resolve this question by developing some mathematical formula of a fair share of land per capita or per country. The fact that Singapore has a population density of 18,000 people per square mile, whereas the United States has a density of only 81 people per square mile, and Australia has only 8 people per square mile, does not mean that Singapore should be granted sovereignty over part of the United States or Australia so as to equalize land per capita. We don't get very far by asking questions such as, is Canada entitled to be as big as it is? Shouldn't Luxembourg be bigger? Should there be fewer Chinese and Indian people or more Swiss and Ugandans? In other words, we don't ask in some abstract sense how big sovereign territories should be or how many people of each race, ethnicity, or culture should exist. Similarly, we won't get very far by asking, how many wild animals should there be and how many humans? Or how much land are various groups of animals and humans entitled to? Rather, we need to start from the facts on the ground. All else being equal, existing humans and animals have the right to be where they are, and the fundamental task of a theory of sovereignty is to protect that right from threats of dispossession or conquest. Of course, not all else is equal, and so these facts on the ground are just a starting point for the moral analysis, not the end of the story. Existing settlement or use patterns may need to be revisited in order to remedy certain injustices or to meet ongoing future needs. Recall the statistic we mentioned in the introduction about how the planet's human population has more than doubled since 1960, pushing human settlement into lands formerly occupied by wild animals, whose population has plummeted by a third. In effect, humans have been engaged in a dramatic conquest of animal-occupied lands, leading to the decimation of animal populations. Thus, when we think about the boundaries of sovereign animal territory, we are immediately confronted with the question of whether we draw boundaries in line with current populations and where they live, or whether we address a history of unjust conquest. The same problem plagues human political theory. The current boundaries of existing states were established unjustly through conquest, colonization, and/or forced assimilation. Nevertheless, Over time, what were initially unjust acts of settlement gave rise to legitimate claims. From the European conquest of the Americas to the Soviet colonization of the Baltic republics, the generations originally responsible for unjust colonization and settlement have given way to subsequent generations who know no other home and have not themselves committed unjust acts of colonial occupation and conquest. Similarly, in the human-animal case, we must acknowledge that while it was and is wrong for humans to settle in animal-occupied land, nevertheless, the human descendants of those settlers become new, quote, facts on the ground, unquote. Justice requires us to take account of historical injustice, but it is impossible to turn back the clock without violating the rights of existing individuals. A plausible political theory of territory has to start from the facts on the ground, where people currently live, and the boundaries of existing communities and states, while also attending to the concerns of justice, both backward and forward-looking. On the one hand, we must recognize the injustice of past actions, and perhaps in some cases offer compensation or restitution. On the other hand, we must start from the present, from individuals currently alive and inhabiting particular territories, and commit to justice for all going forward. We will return in a moment to the question of restitution for historic injustice. First, let us consider the question of forward-looking justice for wild animals. Let us start with the facts on the ground. Humans have drastically invaded and compromised wild animal habitat, but there are still large tracts of undeveloped territory inhabited by wild animals. This includes not just pristine wilderness, but large territories where humans have an extraction footprint, forestry, mining, domestic animal grazing, etc., but minimal settlement. Wild animals are the de facto residents of the area. So we begin with the proposition that all habitats not currently or settled by humans should be considered sovereign animal territory. The air, the sea, the lakes and rivers, and all remaining ecologically viable wild lands, whether pristine wilderness or regreened lands, whether large tracts or small enclaves. These lands are currently occupied by wild animals, and we do not have the right to colonize or displace the citizens of these spaces. This means, effectively, an end to expansion of human settlement. Our other incursions into sovereign animal zones, to log, mine, or graze domesticated animals, for example, carry our impact well beyond the boundaries of where we live, into areas that are inhabited by billions of wild animals. Many of these activities would be drastically curtailed or altered if we recognize the basic negative rights of animals. The number of grazing domesticated animals would be greatly reduced. Logging, mining, and wild food gathering would all be transformed to limit harms to animals. But recognizing these zones as sovereign animal territory would go further than cessation of direct harm in the process of resource extraction. While human activity would not necessarily cease within these zones, it would need to be renegotiated in light of the interests of wild animal communities who are sovereign or co-sovereign there. These interests extend beyond harm prevention to protection of the viability of ecosystems and the self-determination of wild animal communities. In other words, it would be renegotiated on the basis of reciprocal relations between sovereign equals. Recognizing wild animal sovereignty thus places two enormous checks on human activity. First, it means this far and no further with regard to human settlement sprawl. This means we build smarter, we build more efficiently, and we rebuild where we have already laid waste, but we no longer build outward, colonizing lands that are animal occupied. Second, it means that our activity in sovereign animal territory, or shared territory, must be conducted on fair terms of cooperation amongst equals. This goes much further than ending our direct violence against wild animals. It means that human management of wild animal territory must go through a process akin to decolonization, replacing unilateral extraction with fair trade, and replacing ecologically destructive cost externalizing practices with sustainable and mutually beneficial ones. Although we can start from existing patterns of human and wild animal settlement, we will inevitably want to rethink some of these existing boundaries. Some of the Earth's ecological zones support abundant life. Others are much more hostile environments. It could be that existing human settlement in rich or fragile ecosystems should be grandfathered, as it were, so that humans would retract their settlement footprint in these areas over time. Conversely, there may be areas in which human settlement can expand in a way that is consistent with increasing the vitality and diversity of wild animal populations. Consider, for example, the status of the enormous territories currently affected by livestock farming. These include vast tracts of land devoted to monocultural crop farming to produce animal feed, as well as many lands subject to cattle grazing. Both practices have decimated wild animal populations and diversity. With the end of livestock farming, these areas could simply be returned to wild animals, or they could be shared with humans under sustainable models for agricultural, resource extraction, or wilderness/leisure activity. For example, hedgerows, managed forests, and a variety of no-till agricultural practices can support a wonderful diversity of species. Indeed, the end of livestock farming would free up enormous territorial zones in which we could negotiate a new relationship with wild animals. We should remember that in the human case, much grief has been caused by drawing arbitrary lines on maps which either fail to mirror the human geography of peoples and ethnic communities or fail to provide a viable land base for the community in question. Luckily, we are learning a great deal about animal geography and the nature of habitats, watersheds, ecosystems, and biospheres, which we can bring to the task of understanding critical boundaries for wild animal communities. Our political boundaries for sovereign wild animal communities can be mapped onto ecologically based boundaries to ensure the viability and stability of sovereign animal communities. Our decision about which lands to rewild, which lands to share in stable symbiotic relationships, and which lands to maintain under more extensive human development or management can be informed by our growing understanding of ecosystems. Current settlement patterns may need to be adjusted, not only in the light of future needs and ecological sustainability, but also to compensate for historical injustices. To be sure, not all past acts of violence against wild animals or habitat destruction were acts of injustice. At many times and in many places, humans were not in the circumstances of justice vis-a-vis wild animals. Humans would not have survived without killing animals for food and clothing, or for self-protection. Having said that, humans have rarely, if ever, restricted themselves to killing out of necessity. Humans have always killed animals for sport, for convenience, or for no reason at all. Indeed, our historic crimes against wild animals are staggering. Consider just one population, sperm whales. Rough estimates suggest that the sperm whale population in 1700 was around 1.5 million individuals. Yankee whaling in the 18th and 19th centuries is estimated to have reduced that population by about a quarter. Whaling activity dropped off in the latter part of the 19th century when spermaceti, used for lighting and lubrication, was replaced by petroleum and kerosene. However, with the arrival of modern industrial whaling in the 20th century, the industry was revived, and approximately 750,000 sperm whales were killed mid-century before being protected under the International Whaling Commission Treaty. Having been reduced to about a quarter of their original numbers, the population of sperm whales is very slowly starting to inch upwards again. Spermaceti and whalebone corsets were useful products for humans, but by no means necessities. The history of whaling is a clear case of wanton destruction of a wild animal population for human convenience. Close to 1.5 million sperm whales used to roam the seas. Today there are fewer than 500,000. Forward-looking justice focuses on our treatment of existing whales, respecting their basic universal rights and their communal sovereignty in ocean habitats. But what does justice require regarding humans' historical decimation of sperm whales? We cannot reanimate or compensate the original victims. In some cases of historical injustice, we can identify ways in which existing populations are worse off than they would have been due to the treatment of their ancestors. Thus, we may be able to offer compensation to currently living people as an appropriate remedy. In the case of sperm whales, however, it's not clear whether, and if so how, descendants of the original victims have been harmed by the injustice to their ancestors. Under these circumstances, it seems that the historical injustice has been superseded by circumstances, and the focus of our efforts should be forward-looking justice. Even so, we have strong reasons at least to acknowledge the facts of historic injustice through education, morals, collective apologies, and other forms of symbolic compensation. As Lucas Meyer notes, even where reparations are not possible, quote, acts of symbolic compensation make it possible for us to act in such a way as to express an understanding of ourselves as people who wish to and would carry out acts of real compensation if this were only possible. If successful, we will have firmly expressed an understanding of ourselves as persons who would provide real compensation to the previously living person or people if this were only possible. We will also have expressed a firm commitment to prevent the repetition of such injustices." End quote. Perhaps there is nothing today we can do to repair the harm done from 250 years of whaling, but acknowledging that wrong should at least strengthen our commitment and obligation to ensure that we fully respect the sovereignty of existing whales. Time matters in thinking about justice. In the immediate aftermath of injustice, we may be able to effect restoration or offer compensation. In the longer term, the facts on the ground change, and forward-looking justice exerts a stronger pull. This makes it all the more urgent, of course, to interrupt injustice when and where it occurs. Aggressors and invaders know the significance of the passage of time and changing circumstances. There is a strong incentive to change the facts on the ground, for example, by settling occupied territories or engaging in ethnic cleansing, and then hold the ground until the balance of justice shifts towards the future. On a more mundane level, we see this kind of behavior in our everyday lives when, for example, someone violates a zoning regulation by building a prohibited structure, in hopes of creating new facts on the ground to pressure regulators to make an exception. One of the obligations to forward-looking justice is to provide strong disincentives against efforts to establish such fait accompli. Section 5. Fair terms of cooperation between sovereign communities. So far, we have argued that a sovereignty framework provides an intellectually compelling way of articulating the presumption of non-interference, which is widespread but under-theorized in the animal rights theory literature. However, we believe that sovereignty also provides a normative framework for addressing another crucial issue that has been under-theorized, namely spillover effects. As we noted earlier, wild animals are vulnerable to harm, not just from direct violations of their basic rights or from encroachment on their territory, but also from a range of inadvertent harms due to the impact of human activity. These include risks from climate change, pollution, for example, oil spills and agricultural runoff, resource extraction, and infrastructure, for example, dams, fences, roads, buildings, and shipping lanes. Some of these risks would be reduced if we stopped encroaching on the habitat of wild animals, but it's important to recall that there is no possibility of hermetically sealing human territory from wild animal territory. For one thing, many wild animals migrate over vast distances, including over or through areas of human settlement. Consider again the white-throat warblers who migrate from the Sahel to Britain, or the northern right whales who migrate from the coasts off New England to Florida. Given that sovereign animal communities exist within and in parallel with human communities, all territory is, in a sense, border territory. We argued earlier that in the regions of overlapping sovereignty, like migration routes, mobility corridors, and shared ecosystems, human communities are not free to pursue their interests in ways that ignore the interests of wild animal communities who are co-sovereign there. Indeed, there are few places in which human activity does not have a direct and immediate impact on sovereign wild animal communities, imposing significant risks of injury and death. We should note that these risks are not all in one direction. Wild animals can pose a threat to human activity, for example, road collisions with deer or moose, birds jamming airplane engines, or to public health, like animal viruses, or indeed from direct attack, such as from grizzly bears or elephants. Such risks are inevitable so long as both humans and wild animals continue to share the planet. And so a crucial task of a theory of animal rights is to determine the appropriate principles for regulating these risks. How should we take into account the interests of wild animals when designing our buildings, roads, shipping lanes, pollution codes, and so on? Is it our duty to minimize risk, to impose only reasonable risk, or to eliminate entirely risks to wild animals? And conversely, what actions can we legitimately undertake to reduce the risks we face from wild animals? These are profoundly important questions which, yet again, are left unaddressed by the traditional animal rights theory injunction to let them be. At the moment, we treat these two issues in diametrically opposite ways. Where wild animals pose a risk to humans, no matter how small, we typically think we are entitled to take any measures to eliminate the risk, even the most lethal measures. If coyotes or prairie dogs pose even a tiny risk to humans or domesticated animals, we feel entitled to exterminate them en masse. But where our activities impose grave threats on wild animals, we often dismiss this as the price of progress. A sovereignty framework, by contrast, insists that we treat the distribution of risks as an issue of justice between sovereign communities. And here we can learn from existing approaches to the imposition of risks and inadvertent harms in the human case. Social life, in both the domestic and international context, invariably involves risks: accidental death and injury, transmission of disease, or destruction of property and livelihoods, to name some obvious examples. Allowing cars to go faster than 10 miles per hour, for example, increases risks for other drivers, pedestrians, and neighboring property owners. Yet most of us think that such risks are worthwhile given the costs to personal liberty and economic productivity if we banned quicker travel. Attempting to reduce risk to zero would paralyze social life. Yet not all forms of imposed risk are permissible or just. Imposing risks on others must meet a number of conditions, including A. The imposed risks are genuinely necessary to achieve some legitimate interest and are proportional to that benefit and not just the result of negligence or callous disregard. B. Both the risks and the attendant benefits are equitably shared overall. The people who suffer risk in one context benefit from risk in other contexts, rather than one group continually being the victims of imposed risk. And C. Society compensates, where possible, the victims of inadvertent harm. We will say a few words about how these principles operate in the human case, and then show how they can also provide guidelines for thinking about fair terms of interaction between sovereign human and wild animal communities. When evaluating risks, we first need to ask if they serve a genuine and legitimate interest. Consider again the case of highways. We could eliminate them and the resulting traffic accidents and pollution entirely, but this would have enormous economic and liberty costs. It might also result in more direct deaths, not fewer, since it would drastically reduce the possibilities for emergency response. And so, as a society, we make difficult choices about highways, whether to have them at all, whether to expand the system or gradually replace it with train networks, how much to invest in making highways as safe as possible, by widening them, adding lanes, lowering speed limits, cutting down roadside trees, or improving car safety, and how much to regulate drivers in terms of age, impairment, and distractions. These decisions may reduce risks, but cannot eliminate them entirely without unduly sacrificing a legitimate interest in mobility. This passes the first test. Risks must be necessary and proportionate to some legitimate good. But this is not the end of the story. We also need to consider the distribution of these burdens and benefits. Many people benefit from highways, but others inevitably suffer, even die. Why is this not unjust? One reason we do not consider this unjust is that no one is singled out in advance to pay the ultimate price for the benefit of others. It's not as if we literally select someone to sacrifice in order to appease an angry god or monster who demands a life in return for allowing passage along the road. Rather, almost all of us choose to drive or be driven on roads for the benefits we gain from mobility, albeit with the risk of harm. It is all of us who share in the benefits and risks of driving, as opposed to some humans being selected to die for the benefit of others. It's true that the risks are not equally shared by all. Some people benefit economically from the highway without ever driving on it, say, a local store owner who benefits from the increased traffic. Others suffer from the highway without ever driving on it, say, a local recluse who wishes there was less traffic and less pollution. But whether these variations violate our sense of fairness is likely to depend on the broader story about how risks are distributed in society. Fairness doesn't require that the risks and benefits of each individual collective decision be equally shared amongst all affected members of society. Rather, it depends on a general sense that since the elimination of all risk is impossible, and since everyone benefits from society in diverse ways and is at risk in diverse ways, risks and benefits should roughly even out over time and across domains. Not that all outcomes are equalized, but that the general level of risk is roughly shared. Perhaps the person who is at greater than average risk of harm from automobiles is at less than average risk from harm from, say, workplace accidents or food poisoning or environmental pathogens, depending on where they live and work. These variations only tip over into injustice if they continually target the same group of people, perhaps because that group is already weak, stigmatized, or disadvantaged in society, such that risks imposed on it are discounted or ignored. If we start to think that a particular racial group, say, has been singled out to bear the risks of social policies or economic progress that primarily benefits others, then concerns of justice are raised. This may happen domestically or internationally. For example, An industry that primarily benefits middle class people might deposit its unsafe waste in poor minority neighborhoods. Or a country may locate its polluting industries on its national borders, hoping that air or water will carry the pollutants into a powerless neighboring country. Even if social risk is in some sense fairly apportioned in general terms and serves a legitimate public interest, there are further requirements of justice, including duties of care and compensation. The fact that risks are fairly distributed is not much consolation to the unfortunate person or her family who ends up in a car accident and is badly disabled as a result. This places a burden on society both to avoid unnecessary risk and to compensate victims. Imagine that the risk potential of a highway derives not from ice and rock fall, which we might view as essentially uncontrollable risks, but rather from a single hairpin bend which has proven fatal time and time again. The situation could be radically improved with some additional signage and a slight widening of the road. In this case, we are likely to say that the risk is no longer reasonable. If a serious risk can be eliminated at small cost, it is negligent not to do so, even if the risk is fairly distributed. As the costs of limiting risk rise, our sense of what is reasonable also shifts as we consider whether those costs could be better spent elsewhere. Our judgment here will vary depending on the wealth of a particular society and the relative costs of policy choices. Society A might have to weigh the costs of road repair against the costs of a few thousand anti-malaria nets. Society B may have to weigh the costs of road repair against the costs of seasonal decorations for its Main Street parade. They will come to different decisions about whether repairing the road is worth it. Compensation is on the other side of this equation. Collective life imposes inevitable risks upon us all, but only some of us will pay a very high price and die or be injured in traffic accidents, for example. Society has a responsibility not just to limit the chance of an accident occurring, but also to compensate victims when the inevitable accident does occur. By collectively assuming responsibility for a victim's medical and rehabilitation costs, or compensation to their family, society can, in some small way, help to restore a fairer balance of benefit and risk. A society that fails to do this is failing in the original proviso to promote the equal sharing of risks of social life. These familiar principles from the human case provide helpful foundations for thinking about our duties of justice to wild animals. As we have emphasized, humans cause inadvertent harms to animals in countless ways. Pollution is an obvious example. Water contamination, pesticide use, air pollution, and rapid climate change are all catastrophic for animal life. Most animals are far more vulnerable than humans to environmental degradation. Human settlement patterns and infrastructure impose risks on animals. For example, nuclear power cooling plants decimate aquatic life, and glass siding and night lighting of skyscrapers kill countless migrating birds. But since we have been relying on highway examples, let's stick with those. In fact, highways are a textbook example of a human infrastructure/activity that imposes enormous harms on wild animals in the form of roadkill. To give you a sense of the scale of the problem, there is a 3.5-kilometer causeway at Long Point, Ontario, which separates Lake Erie from an adjoining wetland, part of a World Biosphere Reserve. It is estimated that on a yearly basis, 10,000 animals of 100 different species, including leopard frogs, map turtles, fox snakes, and many small mammals, are run over on this short stretch of road. Granted, Long Point is a particularly egregious example, but it gives you some idea of the incomprehensible carnage that human roads inflict on wild animals. Is this incredible carnage a violation of our duties of justice to animals? In light of the principles discussed earlier, the answer must surely be yes. But let's consider the case more carefully to eliminate the nature of this injustice and ways in which we might overcome it. The obvious problem is that the costs and benefits overall are not fairly shared. Humans benefit from the roads either directly or as part of a broader sharing of risks and benefits of social cooperation. Wild animals, however, do not benefit from human highways or from human society more generally, nor is the risk we impose on them offset by risks they impose on us. In general, the risks imposed on us by wild animals pale in comparison with the risks we impose on them. This incredible disparity of risk should ring alarm bells for our sense of justice. It is akin to one state exporting its pollution downstream or downwind to a neighboring state without any reciprocity of benefits or risks. In this situation, How can we achieve justice in the distribution and imposition of risk? The most obvious implication is that we have a duty to reduce the disproportionate risks we impose on wild animals wherever possible. This would include a variety of modifications to human development practices, such as locating and designing structures in light of animal habits and migratory patterns, constructing animal underpasses under roads, creating wildlife corridors, and fitting vehicles with wildlife warning devices. Retrofits might be expensive, but if such modifications were taken into account in the initial design and development stages, the costs would be minimal. This would ensure both a fairer distribution of risks, but also that we are not guilty of negligently disregarding risk to others. In the case of most human development practices, the costs to animals have never entered the picture. It's not as if humans have made a careful assessment of whether risks imposed on animals can be justified by the benefits. These risks have simply been ignored. But this is the bare minimum. Wealthy human societies could take many more steps to mitigate inadvertent harms to wild animals without imposing unreasonable costs on human development. It might cost quite a bit of money to stop polluting the environments we share with animals, or to redesign vehicles and buildings to reduce impacts, to construct diversions or barriers to protect fish from power plants, to redesign agricultural tilling and harvesting techniques to better protect small rodents and animals or nesting birds. But the costs would not be crippling. As with many kinds of change, the transition would be challenging, but once new ways of thinking are in place, they become second nature. Consider the example of switching from a standard North American diet to a vegan one. At first, one might be obsessed with food, focused on the Roquefort or pork chops left behind, on learning new recipes and cooking techniques, on changes to the body, and so on. But over time, the newer diet is normalized, and longer-term vegans spend no more time on food and nutrition planning or preparation than anybody else. And if the switch to veganism were accomplished on a societal scale, with food rituals reconceived and human ingenuity redirected to developing delicious vegan cuisine, the sense of deprivation would disappear altogether. When considering the costs to humans making certain changes, we need to distinguish a transition period from the longer term. In the transition period, there can be a sense of deprivation of past freedoms and opportunities, and a powerful awareness of the burden of new practices. So there needs to be a transition strategy to deal with this. For example, incremental changes, lots of experimentation, compensations, and so on. But in judging what are reasonable efforts to bring about the circumstances of justice, the fundamental issue is not the transition costs, which can be offset, but whether the transition leads to fair and sustainable practices in the long term. So far, we have focused on one side of the equation of reciprocity, how humans impose risks on wild animal communities, which are not offset by the sharing of benefits from cooperation. Because wild animals are not part of a shared community with humans in which overall risks are balanced, the risks we impose on them are unmitigated and must be reduced. Let us turn now to the other side of the coin, the risks that wild animals impose on us. Humans used to be at considerable risk from several species of wild animal. We may have eliminated our natural predators, but we still face risks, from venomous snakes to tigers, grizzly bears, elephants, and crocodiles. We tend to look at any risk posed by wild animals to humans as unacceptable. However, considering the enormous risks we pose to animals, it is unreasonable to expect zero risk in the opposite direction. Instead, we should accept a certain level of risk from the presence of wild animals in areas of overlapping sovereignty. This does not mean that we do not have the right to defend ourselves when under attack, but human communities do not have the right to eliminate the general risks posed by the presence of wild animals in overlapping zones. So, for example, if we choose to live somewhere abutting wild lands in which coyotes, mountain lions, or elephants live, then we must accept a certain level of risk for ourselves, our children, and our animal companions. We cannot demand that the coyotes be killed so we can live risk-free. If we choose to drive on country roads at dusk, we must accept the risk of harm from an accidental collision with a deer or moose. In other words, we cannot demand zero risk for ourselves at the same time that human societies impose extraordinary risks on wild animal communities. There is never going to be a total equity in the level of imposed risk, but we can certainly reduce the asymmetry by minimizing the risks we impose on wild animals while learning to live with the risks they impose on us. We can also reduce this asymmetry by thinking about the ways we can benefit wild animals. As we have noted, the injustice of the risks imposed by human development depends in part on the fact that wild animals do not benefit from this development. But as we discussed earlier, there may be ways that humans can benefit wild animals. While animal rights theory has been rightly cautious about human interventions in wild animal societies, we have argued that not all positive interventions are illegitimate. Some interventions can protect the interests and autonomy of wild animal communities, such as intervention to block the spread of a devastating virus. Another example would be rewilding projects that humans can undertake to enrich or revitalize degraded habitats. Insofar as humans can assist wild animals in these cases, the gross asymmetry of risk imposition can be mitigated to some extent. Our ability to help wild animals, under strict parameters, provides some opportunity for reciprocity in our relations with them. It doesn't obviate our responsibility to reduce the risks we impose on animals, but in many cases risk imposition will remain unavoidable. Justifiable positive interventions provide us an opportunity to partially right the balance. Finally, consider the issue of compensation. Even if we reduce the risks we impose on wild animals, there will inevitably be inadvertent harm. What then do we owe the wild animal victims of our activity? Consider again the causeway at Long Point. The discussion so far makes it clear that humans have many duties to the local wildlife at different stages of decision making. In fact, the causeway is in the process of being rebuilt using wildlife barriers and tunnels. This will allow humans to continue to access Long Point without decimating other animals in the process. Even the best designed causeway, however, is still going to result in some animal injuries and deaths, and so we have a duty of compensation to individuals as a way of mitigating the unequal burdens of risk. Compensation in this context would mean healing and rehabilitating injured animals where possible, and caring for orphaned offspring if they could be identified. This is hardly a novel idea. There are already many wildlife refuges that carry out this kind of work. However, at present, animal research reaches few victims, in part because it depends on a handful of unusually compassionate individuals responding to injured animals, rather than a general social strategy for discharging our duty of care for animals suffering the consequences of risks that we impose on them. Affirming a duty of compensation opens up a host of new questions. We must consider the specifics of how to compensate them. Some wild animals, injured by human roads or other activity, can be rehabilitated and safely released back into the wild. Those are straightforward cases. But in many other cases, individuals are disabled in ways that make return to the wild impossible. While in general, it is always a violation of the basic rights of wild animals to remove them from the wild and forcibly confine them, as pets or as zoo exhibits, the case of disabled animals is a special case. For these animals, life in the wild is no longer possible, and so we have a duty to provide them with the appropriate care in some sort of refuge. Obviously, such refuges should be designed to meet the interests of the disabled animals as far as possible, providing food, shelter, care, freedom of movement, privacy, and companionship. Identifying the interests of wild animals in a refuge environment is not an easy matter. For example, it may not be in their interests for us to reconstruct for them a life that approximates as closely as possible a life in the wild. There is a danger here of looking backwards, focusing too much on what has been lost rather than what is in the animal's interests looking forward. If they cannot be returned to the wild and are under human care, then these animals become, in a sense, refugees from a former life which is no longer available to them. At this point, we have a duty to welcome them as citizens of our community. It would obviously be preferable if they had never become refugees in the first place, but once that die is cast, we need to look forwards, not backwards. We need to shift from seeing them as members of a separate and autonomous community or nation pursuing its own destiny, to be co-members of citizens of our community, cooperating in our new shared destiny. Overemphasis on attempting to reconstruct a lost way of life can blind us to the new opportunities open to animals in changed circumstances. We shouldn't fetishize them as damaged exemplars of their wild counterparts, but respond to them as individuals with special needs and interests in a new environment. For example, many of these animals might eschew human contact as is their choice, but others may not only become habituated to human contact, which is often unavoidable during the rescue and rehabilitation process, but may even thrive on human interaction. Some might form friendships with humans or animals of other species. A coyote disabled in a car collision who could no longer roam, hunt, or defend a territory has in some sense morphed into a new kind of being. In the context of a wildlife refuge, she might bond with humans, or rabbits and squirrels for that matter. She might develop a taste for obstacle courses, or for riding in vehicles, or watching rock videos. A disabled parrot might enjoy the challenges of learning Spanish or solving puzzles. The point is that once an unfortunate accident forces us to bring these animals under human care in shared animal society, we need to respond to them fully as individuals, not sacrifice them to fantasies of a reconstructed wildness. Our duties to the animal should be based on an assessment of their current interests living in shared society, not on a commitment to ideas like naturalness or species norm, ideas which ignore the fact that this animal's community has changed. Animal refuges should be designed not as pale copies of nature, but as stimulating, diverse environments in which unique animals can find new ways of being if they so choose. In short, a sovereignty approach to impose risks and inadvertent harms helps to identify a number of principles for governing fair terms of interaction between sovereign human and wild animal communities. Principles of equity, reciprocity, and compensation. This would mean, for example, that we should relocate and redesign cars, roads, buildings, and other infrastructure to reduce animal impacts and create effective animal corridors and buffer zones. It also means that when animals are inadvertently injured through contact with human activity, despite our best efforts to minimize these risks, we should set up wildlife rescue centers for their rehabilitation and hopefully release back to the wild. And we need to learn to live with reasonable risks from the presence of wild animals. Section 6. Conclusion. We began this chapter by outlining the myriad ways in which wild animals are vulnerable to human activity: direct violence, habitat destruction, inadvertent harms, and positive interventions. Animal rights theory has focused primarily on direct violence towards animals. We agree that these violations must end, but this is only the beginning of sorting out the complexities of human relations with wild animals. We have argued that a sovereignty approach provides guidance on how to understand our diverse obligations to wild animals. Respect for wild animal sovereignty, the right of wild animal communities to lead autonomous, self-directed lives, places a strong check on human activity and on interventions in the wild. First of all, sovereignty anchors the right of individuals to belong to a specific territory and autonomous community, a community which cannot be invaded, colonized, or robbed by others. Thus, recognition of wild animal sovereignty would bring a halt to human destruction of wild animal habitat. It would force the recognition that these are inhabited lands, and that existing inhabitants have a right to maintain their forms of community on that territory. Second, sovereignty provides a framework for cooperation between communities on a basis of equality and non-exploitation. As such, it would place significant constraints on human activity in areas of overlapping sovereignty, or in contexts of cross-border effects, to minimize inadvertent harms to wild animals and to compensate animals whom we injure. Sovereignty also provides an appropriate framework for thinking through our obligations of positive intervention to wild animals. We must not intervene in the internal workings of wild animal communities in ways that undermine their autonomy, effectively placing them under permanent human management. However, some forms of positive assistance are consistent with respect for sovereignty. A duty of assistance can be triggered by natural disasters which undermine the viability of sovereign animal communities and which we are in a position to relieve. Or it can be triggered by external threats to wild animal communities from a destructive invader, for example, a rogue bacterium or a giant meteor, not to mention human invaders. We do not have a duty to, quote, police the animal world, end quote, but we do have a duty to protect wild animals against threats to their sovereignty. We concede duties to protect and assist wild animals as part of the reciprocity of states in a system of sovereign communities. We benefit from the presence of wild animals and from the resources we share with them. Sometimes we are harmed by wild animals, although these harms pale in comparison with the harms that we inflict in return. It is our duty to be aware of and to minimize the harms we cause to wild animals and try to balance out these harms, when possible, through appropriate acts of positive assistance. Finally, sovereignty helps make sense of our intuitions about why individual acts of assistance cannot be captured by any general formula about, quote, never interfering in nature, end quote. We do not owe obeisance to some kind of law of nature. We owe duties of justice to wild animals. In general, respecting their sovereignty means we should be very cautious about undertaking interventions in nature. but respect for sovereignty is consistent with undertaking many individual and limited scale acts of assistance which do not undermine the ability of wild animal communities to flourish as independent and self-determining communities. In all of these ways, we believe the sovereignty approach provides more compelling answers than are currently available within the animal rights theory literature. In much of that literature, issues of intervention and inadvertent harm are either ignored entirely or are reduced to the slogan of "let them be." As we have seen, that slogan simply cannot do the work that is needed in sorting out our ethical responsibilities to the wild animal communities around us. As we have noted in Chapter 1, other writers have also recognized the limits of an animal rights approach that focuses only on individual capacities and interests, and have argued for a more relational approach. Perhaps the most detailed approach is the recent book by Claire Palmer, who generates certain relational duties towards different groups of animals, depending on the role humans have played in generating particular vulnerabilities amongst those animals. Having made farm animals and companion animals dependent on us through domestication, we are now responsible for fulfilling their needs. Having made wild animals vulnerable through loss of habitat, we may be responsible for remedying that harm. But if we are not causally implicated in their vulnerability, then we have no positive duties towards them. In this sense, Palmer's relational theory is in fact essentially remedial. We acquire relational duties only because we need to remedy harms we are responsible for, and which ideally should not have occurred in the first place. Relational duties are a second best response when the first best option of non-relationship is no longer possible, and these relational duties are remedial in nature. Our account, by contrast, is relational in a deeper way. Palmer defends the laissez-faire intuition on the ground that, in the absence of human-caused injustice, we lack positive moral obligations towards wild animals. Our approach defends the sovereignty of wild animals on the ground that there is a great moral value at stake in the autonomy of wild animal communities, and that establishing relationships of sovereignty is the best way of respecting those moral values. Respect for the sovereignty of wild animals, like respect for the co-citizenship of domesticated animals, instantiates a morally valuable relationship and fulfills our positive duty to relate to animals in ways that respect their interests, preferences, and agency. None of these positive values come through in Palmer's remedial account of relational duties. There is no account of the moral goods or purposes that underpin relations of sovereignty for wild animals or co-citizenship for domesticated animals. And as a result, her account of what we in fact owe wild animals and domesticated animals is, we believe, seriously deficient. In the end, her account of justice towards wild animals, like traditional animal rights theory, says little beyond the need to avoid the direct harming of the basic negative rights of individual animals, or remedying these harms once we have committed them. Palmer's view is one version of the concentric circles model of relational duties. In this model, found in Callcott and Wentz, as well as Palmer, our moral duties are determined by our emotional, spatial, or causal proximity to different groups of animals. We have positive duties to animals close to us, such as domesticated animals, but only negative duties to wild animals far from us. But as Jack Swart notes, this is seriously misleading. It would be more accurate to say that we have duties of care and justice in both cases, but that the sort of actions that are called for differ. Swart himself explains this difference in terms of the nature of animals' dependency. Domesticated animals are dependent on their relationship to us for their food and shelter, and so we have duties of specific care towards them, whereas wild animals are dependent on their relationship to their natural environment, and so our duties of care in this context are non-specific, and are focused on, quote, making efforts to maintain their living conditions and their dependent relationship with the environment, end quote. In each case, we have a positive duty to ensure that animals have what they are dependent on. Part of what it means to meet a duty of care towards others is to care for the relationship on which others depend, and that is equally true of wild and domesticated animals. They simply depend on different types of relationships. Contra Palmer, the fact that our duty of care towards wild animals is non-specific is a response to their needs, not evidence that we lack positive duties to respond to their needs. Our relational view is obviously closer in this respect to Swart than to Palmer. Indeed, our account of the duty to respect and uphold the sovereignty of wild animal communities over their territory can be seen as simply a more political way of restating Swart's idea that we have a duty to respect the dependency of wild animals on their environment. Similarly, Our account in Chapter 5 of the duty to accord co-citizenship to domesticated animals can be seen as a more political restatement of his idea that we have a duty of specific care to animals dependent on us. But just as the political language of co-citizenship helps specify the duty of specific care to domesticated animals, so the political language of sovereignty helps specify the duty of non-specific care to wild animals, enabling us to address some fundamentally political issues about rights, property, territory, risk, and mobility. In this respect, both Palmer and Swart and other relational theories within animal rights theory remain locked within the field of applied ethics, disconnected from the political theories that govern our legal and political life. Needless to say, adopting a sovereignty approach is not a magic formula, and our discussion so far leaves many questions unanswered, not least the political question of how to enforce wild animal sovereignty. In traditional human political theory, the right to be recognized as a sovereign authority has always been closely tied to the ability to assert one's sovereignty, both internally and externally. A state is recognized as sovereign because it has effective control over its territory. To be sure, there are different ways of enforcing sovereignty in the human case. In terms of external challenges, a state can assert its sovereignty through the possession of sufficient military power, but it can also do so through treaties of mutual protection and regional security, for example, membership in NATO, or through upward delegation in multi-nation states. For example, Canada's First Nations have delegated upwards to the Canadian state the responsibility for their defense, or through participation in international bodies which overlap or pool the sovereignty of individual states. What would be the comparable political processes in the case of wild animal sovereignty? Wild animals are usually not in a position to physically defend themselves from human interference. They cannot represent themselves in diplomatic negotiations or on international bodies. They cannot make collective decisions about delegating responsibility for the protection of their sovereign interests. So what then would be the political mechanism to assert or enforce animal sovereignty? The answer lies in some form of proxy representation by human beings who are committed to the principle of animal sovereignty. At present, we have little idea of what such a system of proxy representation would look like. As we noted in Chapter 5, a related question arises concerning the political representation of domesticated animals within a scheme of co-citizenship. Various proposals have been made in that context for something like an animal ombudsperson or advocate. In their article envisaging simian sovereignty, Gooden, Pateman, and Pateman argue that a sovereign great ape nation would inevitably take the form of a protectorate for which humans act as trustees. Such a trustee or ombudsperson or advocate would presumably have the mandate to protect wild animals from colonization, conquest, and the unfair imposition of risks, and also to evaluate the impact of proposed positive interventions. We do not have a detailed blueprint for such institutional mechanisms. As we argued in Chapter 5, our concern at this stage is not to advocate the creation of this or that institutional mechanism, but rather to clarify the underlying picture of human-animal relations that drives institutional reform. We need first to identify the goals of any new scheme of representation which, we have argued, should be built around the idea of sovereignty for wild animals. Effective representation within this scheme will require institutional reforms at any number of levels, both domestic and international, covering issues of the environment, development, transportation, public health, and so on. In all these institutions, the right of wild animals as sovereign communities need to be represented.